In the harsh winter of 1887, Wyoming, a desperate pregnant widow named Sarah Lenning stumbled through snow-covered plains, her swollen belly aching with hunger and her feet raw from walking. Every door she knocked on had turned her away, until she reached the last farmhouse for miles. Behind that weathered door lived Thatcher Rourke, a solitary rancher who hadn't spoken to another soul in months. He was known throughout the territory as a man who kept to himself, nursing old wounds that ran deeper than the Wyoming frost. When Thatcher opened his door that bitter evening, he saw something in Sarah's eyes that he recognized, the look of someone who had lost everything but refused to surrender. What started as a simple act of charity became something neither expected. But what happens when the past catches up to a woman trying to build a new life and a man finally ready to live again? The wind cut through Sarah's threadbare coat like a blade as she stood on Thatcher Rourke's doorstep, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Her hands trembled, whether from cold or desperation, she couldn't say. The worn leather, Bible clutched against her chest, was all that remained of her former life, its pages yellowed and edges frayed from countless readings during the long, lonely nights since Thomas had died. Thatcher studied her through the narrow opening of his door, taking in the sight of this pregnant stranger who had appeared like a ghost from the Wyoming wilderness. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, damp with melted snow, and her green eyes held a mixture of fierce determination and barely contained fear. She was young, perhaps 25, but carried herself with the weight of someone who had seen too much sorrow for her years. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I haven't eaten in 2 days. I can work for food. I can clean, cook, mend. I don't ask for charity, just a chance." Something in her words, or perhaps the way she held her head high, despite her obvious desperation, stirred something long dormant in Thatcher's chest. He was a man who had learned to live with silence, who had grown comfortable in the emptiness of his days. At 42, he had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the pain of caring for another soul. Yet here stood this woman, swollen with child and starving, asking not for pity, but for the dignity of honest work. Without a word, he stepped aside and opened the door wider. Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe her good fortune, before stepping carefully across the threshold. The warmth of the house enveloped her like an embrace, and she had to steady herself against the doorframe as relief threatened to buckle her knees. The interior of Thatcher's home spoke of a man who had once shared his life but now lived alone. The furniture was well made but sparse. A wooden table scarred with use, 2 chairs where once there might have been 4, a rocking chair positioned near the fireplace that looked as though it hadn't been occupied in years. The walls were bare, save for a single daguerreotype on the mantelpiece, its subjects too distant to make out in the flickering firelight. Sarah's eyes swept the room, taking in details that told the story of interrupted life. A woman's presence had once graced this space. She could see it in the way the curtains hung, in the careful placement of a dried flower arrangement that had long since lost its color, in the small decorative touches that no man would think to add. But dust had settled over these remnants like snow, speaking of neglect born not from carelessness, but from grief. "Sit," Thatcher said, his voice rusty from disuse. He gestured toward the chair near the fire, and Sarah lowered herself gratefully into its worn cushions. The heat from the hearth seemed to penetrate her very bones, and for the first time in weeks she felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. Thatcher moved with practiced efficiency to the kitchen area, ladling soup from a pot that hung over the fire into a wooden bowl. The aroma of beef and vegetables filled the room, and Sarah's stomach cramped with hunger so intense it was almost painful. When he placed the bowl before her along with a thick slice of bread, she had to blink back tears. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. He nodded curtly and retreated to the far side of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, as if maintaining distance might protect him from whatever complications this woman's presence might bring. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, trying not to appear as ravenous as she felt. The food was simple but well prepared, and she found herself wondering about the man who had taken her in. Thatcher was tall and lean, with the weathered hands and sun-lined face of someone who worked the land. His dark hair was shot through with silver at the temples, and his brown eyes held a wariness that spoke of old pain, carefully guarded. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt, worn denim pants, boots that had seen countless seasons, but everything about him suggested competence and self-reliance. "The baby," he said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "When?" Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her rounded belly. "Soon. A month. Perhaps less." She met his gaze steadily. "I won't burden you with that. I'll be gone before—" "Where will you go?" The question was asked without emotion, but Sarah sensed genuine curiosity behind it. She had no answer. The truth was, she had nowhere to go, no one left who would take her in. Thomas's family had made their feelings clear after the funeral. A pregnant widow was a liability they couldn't afford, especially one with no dowry or useful connections. Her own parents were long dead, and she had exhausted what little charity existed in the mining towns she had passed through. "I'll find a way," she said finally, though they both knew the words rang hollow. Thatcher studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her pretense of confidence to the terror beneath. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault against the windows, and the reality of her situation pressed down upon her like a physical weight. Winter in Wyoming was not forgiving to the homeless, and a woman with child faced even grimmer prospects. In the dresser drawer across the room, hidden beneath carefully folded linens, lay a simple gold ring, a wedding band that had once symbolized promises of forever. Thatcher had placed it there 3 years ago, when the weight of wearing it had become too much to bear. Sometimes on the darkest nights, he would take it out and hold it, remembering the softness of Margaret's hand, the sound of her laughter, the way she had hummed while she worked. But those memories brought more pain than comfort now, and the ring remained hidden, like so much of his heart. As Sarah finished her soup and settled back in the chair, her eyelids growing heavy with exhaustion and warmth, Thatcher found himself making a decision that surprised him. Perhaps it was the way she had asked for work, rather than charity, or the quiet dignity with which she bore her circumstances. Perhaps it was simply that the house had felt too empty for too long. "You can stay," he said quietly, "until the baby comes, until you're strong enough to travel." Sarah's eyes flew open, and for a moment she simply stared at him in disbelief. You don't even know me. I could be anyone." "Could be," he agreed, "but you're not. You're a woman alone, with child, in the middle of winter. That's enough for—" "Now!" The gratitude in her eyes was almost too much to bear, and Thatcher turned away, busying himself with banking the fire for the night. He had made his offer without fully considering what it would mean, sharing his space with another person, breaking the careful routines that had sustained him through his isolation. But as he listened to Sarah's quiet breathing and the whisper of her dress as she shifted in the chair, he found that the prospect didn't frighten him as much as he had expected. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight, the storm could rage outside while inside. 2 broken souls found shelter in the simple act of human kindness. The morning sun filtered through frost-covered windows, casting delicate patterns of ice crystals across the wooden floor. Sarah woke slowly, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the blessed absence of hunger pangs. For a moment, she lay still in the makeshift bed Thatcher had arranged for her on the settee, listening to the quiet sounds of a household beginning its day. From the kitchen came the soft clink of metal against pottery, the whisper of kindling catching fire, the measured footsteps of a man who had performed these same rituals countless mornings alone. Sarah touched her rounded belly, feeling the baby's gentle movements beneath her palm, and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude for this unexpected sanctuary. She rose carefully, smoothing her rumpled dress and attempting to tame her unruly hair. In the pale morning light, she could see more details of Thatcher's home, the careful craftsmanship of the furniture, the way everything had its proper place, the subtle signs of a life that had once been shared but now was lived in solitude. "Morning," Thatcher said without turning from the stove when he heard her stirring. His voice was still rusty with sleep, but there was a gentleness to it that hadn't been there the night before. "Good morning," Sarah replied, her own voice soft, with uncertainty. "I hope I didn't oversleep. I'm used to rising earlier, but the warmth, you needed the rest." He ladled porridge into a bowl and set it on the table along with a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool air. "Eat." As Sarah settled at the table, she noticed the photograph on the mantelpiece more clearly. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing beside a man who bore a strong resemblance to Thatcher but looked years younger, his face unmarked by the lines of grief that now defined his features. Between them stood a small girl, perhaps 5 years old, with dark curls and her mother's bright smile. "Your family?" Sarah asked quietly, nodding toward the photograph. Thatcher's hand stilled on his coffee cup, and for a long moment he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Was Margaret and Emma. They died 3 years ago. Fever took them both within a week of each other." The simple words carried a weight of pain that made Sarah's chest tighten with sympathy. She understood that kind of loss, the way grief could hollow out a person's insides, leaving them walking through life like an empty shell. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it deeply. "They looked like they were happy." They were. Thatcher's gaze remained fixed on the photograph. "Margaret used to say this house was too quiet, that we needed to fill it with noise and laughter. She was always humming, always talking to Emma about everything she was doing, teaching her to cook, to sew, to read." His voice grew softer. "After they died, the silence was... it was easier than remembering." Sarah reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small, cracked photograph of her own. She placed it gently on the table between them. "Thomas," she said simply, "my husband. He died in a mining accident 4 months ago." Thatcher looked at the image, a young man with honest eyes and calloused hands, his arm around Sarah's waist, both of them smiling at some joke the photographer had told. Sarah looked different in the picture, younger, fuller in the face. Her eyes bright with the kind of hope that comes from believing in the future. "He looks like a good man," Thatcher said finally. He was, patient and kind, always singing while he worked. He used to say that life was too short to spend it frowning. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. "He was excited about the baby, spent his evenings carving little animals for the nursery, said he wanted to have a whole barnyard ready by the time the child arrived." "What happened after?" Thatcher asked, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be pleasant. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Thomas's brother Marcus said the mine accident was suspicious, that Thomas might have been involved in something illegal. The mining company seized what little savings we had, said it was compensation for lost equipment. Marcus offered to take me in, but..." She paused, her hand moving protectively to her belly. "He made it clear what kind of arrangement he had in mind. When I refused, his wife suggested I might find more suitable accommodation elsewhere." The bitterness in her voice was carefully contained, but Thatcher caught the slight tremor in her hands as she spoke. He had seen enough of the world to understand what kind of arrangement a man like Marcus might propose to a desperate widow, and the knowledge stirred an unexpected anger in his chest. "So you left," he said. "I left. Took what little I could carry and started walking west. Thomas always said Wyoming was God's country, that there was enough space here for people to start over." She managed a wan smile. "I suppose I was testing that theory." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in memories of losses too large for words. Outside, the wind had calmed, and sunlight sparkled off the snow-covered fields that stretched toward the distant mountains. It was beautiful country, stark and unforgiving, but possessed of a grandeur that made human troubles seem small by comparison. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Going somewhere where the memories aren't so thick in the air?" Thatcher considered the question seriously. "Every day for the first year. Packed my things a dozen times, stood at that door ready to walk away. But," he gestured around the room, "this is where they lived, where Emma took her first steps, where Margaret sang while she kneaded bread. Leaving felt like abandoning them all over again. And now it's just habit, I suppose. The grief isn't as sharp as it was, but it's familiar. Sometimes I think I'm afraid that if I let it go completely, I'll forget what they sounded like, what it felt like to be happy." Sarah nodded slowly, understanding the sentiment more than she cared to admit. "Thomas used to say that memory was the heart's way of keeping our loved ones alive. But I've started to wonder if holding on too tightly might be keeping us from living ourselves." It was a profound observation, and Thatcher found himself studying this young woman with new interest. Despite her circumstances, alone, pregnant, essentially homeless, there was a wisdom to her that spoke of deep reflection and inner strength. She wasn't just surviving, she was thinking, questioning, trying to make sense of loss in a way that honored both the dead and the living. "You read?" he asked, nodding toward the Bible she kept close at hand. "Every day it was Thomas's, given to him by his mother. Some of the pages are falling out and the binding is nearly gone, but," she shrugged, "it's all I have left of him. Besides this," she touched her belly gently, "and it helps me remember that even in the darkest times, there's still hope for dawn." Thatcher rose and disappeared into another room, returning a moment later with a small leather-bound volume. He placed it on the table beside Sarah's Bible. Margaret's prayer book. She read from it every morning and evening, said it helped her feel connected to something larger than herself. Sarah opened the book carefully, running her fingers over. The delicate pages filled with handwritten prayers and pressed flowers. She had beautiful handwriting. She was a teacher before we married, came west with her family when she was 16, taught school in 3 different towns before settling here. She always said education was the key to building a better life. "What would she think of your taking in a stranger?" Thatcher was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she had overstepped. When he finally answered, his voice was soft with remembering. "She would have had you fed, bathed and fussed over before. You could protest. Margaret never met a stray she wouldn't try to heal. Animals, people, it didn't matter. She used to say that kindness was the only thing that made life bearable. She sounds wonderful," she was, "and stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something. I used to think it was impossible that someone so gentle could also be so fierce, but Margaret proved me wrong every day." He smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of warmth Sarah had seen cross his features. "She would have liked you, I think. You have that same quality, soft on the surface but steel underneath." The comparison made Sarah's cheeks warm, though she wasn't entirely sure why. She had spent so many months thinking of herself as weak, as a burden to be endured rather than a person with worth, that hearing Thatcher speak of her strength felt both foreign and welcome. As the morning progressed into afternoon, they found themselves sharing more stories, small memories that painted pictures of the lives they had lived before grief redefined them. Sarah spoke of Thomas's terrible singing voice and his talent for making her laugh even on the hardest days. Thatcher told her about Emma's love of horses and Margaret's ambitious vegetable garden that never quite turned out the way she planned. With each shared memory, the invisible walls between them grew a little lower, and the house felt a little less empty. Neither spoke of it directly, but both sensed that something was shifting in the careful balance of their solitude, something that felt both dangerous and necessary, like the first tentative warmth of spring after a long, brutal winter. The 3rd day of Sarah's stay dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of pristine blue sky that made the Wyoming landscape appear infinite. She woke to the now familiar sounds of Thatcher's morning routine, but today something felt different, less like she was an intruder in his solitude, and more like she belonged, however temporarily, in this quiet rhythm of daily life. After breakfast, Sarah insisted on helping with the household tasks despite Thatcher's protests. "You said I could work for my keep," she reminded him with a gentle smile. "I meant what I said. I don't take charity." He watched as she moved carefully around the kitchen, her movements economical but graceful, despite her advanced pregnancy. There was something soothing about having another person in the space, he realized. The soft rustle of her skirts, a quiet humming she did unconsciously while she worked, the way she seemed to bring life back to corners of the house that had felt dead for too long. "The stove runs hot," he warned as she reached for a pot. "Margaret always said—" He stopped, abruptly, surprised by how easily the reference had slipped out. "What did she say?" Sarah asked gently, not pausing in her work. "That it had a mind of its own, like it was trying to cook everything twice as fast as it should." Thatcher found himself smiling at the memory. "She burned more meals in the first year of our marriage than most women burn in a lifetime. And yet you kept her," Sarah teased, "and was rewarded with something that might have been a chuckle. Couldn't let her go. She made up for her cooking with other talents." The words came out before he could stop them, and Thatcher felt heat rise in his cheeks. But Sarah only laughed, a sound like water over stones, clear and musical. Thomas was the same way with carpentry. He could handle dynamite and mining equipment like they were toys, but ask him to build a simple shelf. She shook her head, still smiling. "I learned to do most of the repairs around our little house. He said I had magic in my hands." As the morning progressed, they fell into an easy partnership. Sarah proved to be an excellent cook, transforming Thatcher's simple ingredients into meals that filled the house with rich, welcoming aromas. Thatcher, for his part, showed her the workings of the ranch, how to read the weather signs, where the best water sources were located, which pastures would be ready for cattle when spring arrived. It was while they were organizing the small pantry that Sarah discovered the narrow stairs leading to the upper level of the house. "What's up there?" she asked. Thatcher's expression grew shuttered. "Storage, mostly. Nothing important." But Sarah had caught something in his tone, a careful blankness that suggested the opposite was true. She didn't press, having learned to recognize the signs of grief held too close to examine. Instead, she continued with her work, humming softly. Under her breath, that afternoon, while Sarah rested, Thatcher had noticed her pressing her hand to her lower back more frequently. He found himself climbing those stairs for the first time in months. The upper level consisted of 2 small bedrooms, one that had been his and Margaret's, the other that had belonged to Emma. He pushed open the door to Emma's room and stepped inside, his chest tightening with familiar pain. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The small bed with its patchwork quilt, the collection of carved animals Thomas had mentioned making for his own expected child, the tiny dress Margaret had been sewing hanging over the chair where she had placed it the day before she fell ill, but it was the wooden cradle in the corner that stopped him cold. He had carved it himself during Margaret's pregnancy, working by lamplight after long days in the fields, sanding each curve until it was smooth as silk. It was meant to hold their daughter, to rock her to sleep with lullabies sung in Margaret's sweet voice. Instead, it had held only absence, only the weight of dreams that would never come to pass. Thatcher approached the cradle slowly, running his hands over the wood that still bore the marks of his careful craftsmanship. The sight of it usually brought nothing but pain. But today, with Sarah's presence filling the house below, he found himself thinking not of what had been lost, but of what might still be possible. A sound from downstairs drew him back to the present, Sarah's voice raised in what sounded like distress. He hurried down to find her standing by the window, one hand pressed to her belly, the other gripping the windowsill for support. "What is it?" he asked, moving quickly to her side. "The baby," she gasped. Something's not right. The pains started a few minutes ago, but they're not like the others. These are sharp and they're not stopping. Thatcher's training from years of ranch work, dealing with difficult births among his livestock, kicked in immediately. He guided Sarah to the rocking chair, noting the pale sheen of sweat on her forehead and the way her breathing had become shallow and quick. "How far apart?" he asked, his voice calm despite the worry gnawing at his chest. "They're not regular, just constant." Sarah doubled over as another wave of pain struck. "Oh, God, it's too early. The baby isn't due for weeks yet." Thatcher knelt beside the chair, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he took her smaller ones in his. "Look at me, Sarah. You're going to be all right. The baby's going to be all right, but I need you to stay calm and tell me exactly what you're feeling." His steady presence seemed to anchor her, and Sarah managed to focus on his face, the concern in his brown eyes, the determined set of his jaw. "The pain is here," she said, pressing his hand to her lower back. "And here." She moved his palm to the curve of her belly. "It feels like everything is tightening at once." Thatcher nodded, his mind working quickly. He had seen this before in cattle, stress-induced early labor that could sometimes be stopped with rest and proper care. But he was no doctor, and the nearest medical help was a day's ride away in good weather. "We need to get you lying down," he said, "and I'm going to make you some tea. There are herbs that might help calm things down." He helped her to the settee, arranging pillows behind her back and covering her with one of Margaret's quilts. As he moved around the kitchen, gathering the medicinal herbs Margaret had always kept dried and ready, Sarah watched him with growing amazement. "How do you know about this?" she asked as he steeped willow bark and chamomile in hot water. "Margaret had 2 miscarriages before Emma," he said quietly. "The doctor taught us what to watch for, what might help. And ranch life teaches you a fair bit about births, even if they're not human ones." The frank honesty of his words, the way he spoke of intimate loss and knowledge without embarrassment, made Sarah's heart clench with something more complex than gratitude. Here was a man who had loved deeply enough to pay attention to his wife's body, to learn what she needed, to remember those lessons even after she was gone. As she sipped the bitter tea, Sarah felt the tight knots of pain in her belly begin to ease. The crisis passed slowly, leaving her exhausted but relieved. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done if I'd been alone." "You weren't alone," Thatcher said simply. "And you won't be." The promise in those words hung in the air between them, unexamined but understood. Later that evening, as Sarah dozed fitfully on the settee and Thatcher sat nearby reading by lamplight, both of them were hyper-aware of how much had shifted in a single afternoon. Trust, Sarah realized, wasn't just about believing someone wouldn't hurt you. It was about knowing they would be there when you needed them most, that they would act without hesitation when crisis struck. Thatcher had proven himself in that moment of fear, showing her a competence and caring that went far beyond simple hospitality. For Thatcher, the afternoon had awakened something he had thought permanently buried, the deep satisfaction of being needed, of having knowledge and strength that could protect and comfort another person. Caring for Sarah during her crisis had felt natural, right in a way that surprised him with its intensity. As the fire burned low and the house settled into evening quiet, both of them were thinking about the cradle upstairs, Thatcher with a mixture of pain and unexpected hope, Sarah with a growing awareness that this temporary arrangement might be becoming something neither of them had planned for. Outside, the wind picked up again, reminding them both that winter was far from over. But inside, warmed by more than just the fire in the hearth, something new was taking root, fragile as spring shoots pushing through snow, but determined to grow despite the harsh conditions that surrounded it. The baby moved beneath Sarah's. A palm, a gentle flutter that seemed to say all was well, and she found herself wondering if this child might be destined for something more than the uncertain future she had planned. Beside her, Thatcher's breathing had deepened into sleep, but his presence remained a comfort, a promise that tomorrow would bring not just survival, but the continued unfolding of whatever this was becoming between them. In the morning, he would climb those stairs again and bring the cradle down, dusting it carefully and placing it beside the fire where the light was warm and soft. But tonight, it was enough to know it was there, waiting like so many other possibilities for the courage to hope again. The morning of the fourth day brought an unexpected visitor, young Billy Henderson from town, his horse steaming in the cold air as he dismounted near Thatcher's front porch. Sarah, who had been hanging laundry on the line despite Thatcher's protests that it was too cold for such work, felt her stomach clench with an inexplicable dread at the sight of the official-looking envelope in the boy's mittened hand. "Morning, Mr. Rourke," Billy called out, his breath forming white puffs in the frigid air. "Got some mail for you. Postmaster said it was urgent. Came all the way from back east." Thatcher emerged from the barn where he had been tending to his horses, his expression immediately wary. In his experience, urgent mail from the east rarely brought good news. He accepted the envelope with a nod of thanks and a coin for Billy's trouble, watching as the boy remounted and rode back toward town before turning his attention to the correspondence. The envelope was addressed to Thatcher Rourke, guardian of Sarah Lenning, in a precise official script that made Sarah's blood run cold. She recognized that handwriting, had seen it on legal documents and business correspondence that Thomas had shown her with growing concern in the weeks before his death. "It's from Marcus," she whispered, sinking onto the porch step as if her legs could no longer support her weight. "Thomas's brother. How did he find me here?" Thatcher's jaw tightened as he tore open the envelope, his eyes scanning the formal, legal language within. As he read, his expression grew darker, and Sarah watched the muscles in his neck cord with tension. "What does it say?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would shatter the fragile peace she had found. "In this place, he's claiming legal guardianship over you and the unborn child," Thatcher said, his voice carefully controlled. "Says, as Thomas's next of kin, he has the right to provide for his brother's widow and ensure the proper care of his brother's child. He's demanding that you return to Pennsylvania immediately." Sarah's hands flew to her belly in an instinctive, protective gesture. "He can't do that. I'm not a child myself. I don't need a guardian. According to this, you do." Thatcher's voice was grim as he read further. "He's citing territorial law regarding destitute women with children. Says you've been declared mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs due to, let me see, emotional distress following the tragic loss of her husband and subsequent irrational decisions to abandon proper family support." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had known Marcus was controlling, had experienced firsthand his assumption that women needed male guidance in all matters, but she hadn't imagined he would go this far. "The mining accident," she said suddenly, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving clicking into place. "Marcus said there were irregularities, that Thomas might have been involved in something illegal. What if Marcus was involved somehow? What if he needed Thomas out of the way?" Thatcher looked up sharply from the letter. "What kind of irregularities?" "Equipment that went missing, claims that didn't match the paperwork, money that couldn't be accounted for." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke, fueled by a growing certainty. "Thomas was asking questions, demanding to see records. He said someone was skimming profits from the miners' claims, taking more than their fair share. The night before, he died. He told me he was going to report what he'd found to the territorial authorities. And then there was a convenient accident," Thatcher said grimly. "Marcus arrived at the funeral with all kinds of papers, documents showing that Thomas had debts I'd never heard of, claims against our property that wiped out everything we'd saved. He said the mining company was being generous by not holding me responsible for Thomas's misdeeds." Sarah's hands were shaking now, whether from cold or fury she couldn't tell. "I was too grief-stricken to question it, too overwhelmed to fight. Back. I just signed whatever he put in front of me. Thatcher studied her face, seeing the intelligence and growing anger there, recognizing the look of someone who was finally understanding how they had been manipulated. What aren't you telling me about Marcus's offer of assistance? Sarah's cheeks burned with shame and anger. He said I could live in his household, that he would provide for me and the baby. But when his wife retired for the evening, he made it clear what my duties would be in exchange for his protection. When I refused, he became angry, said I was an ungrateful woman who didn't understand how precarious my position was, how easily a woman alone could find herself in truly desperate circumstances. The fury that flashed across Thatcher's features was swift and dangerous. He had seen enough of the world to understand exactly what kind of protection Marcus had offered, and the knowledge that Sarah had been forced to flee such a situation stirred something primal and protective in his chest. "He's not getting you back," Thatcher said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "You don't understand," Sarah said desperately. "Look at the rest of the letter. He's not just making demands. He has legal authority. If I don't return willingly, he'll send territorial marshals to collect me. And if anyone is found to be harboring me against his lawful claim—" Thatcher read the remainder of the document, his expression growing stonier with each sentence. Marcus had been thorough in his legal preparations, citing precedents and territorial statutes that would indeed give him significant power over Sarah's circumstances. Worse, he had clearly done his research on Thatcher as well, referencing his isolated circumstances and questionable suitability as a guardian for a woman in distress. "He's threatening you too," Sarah said, recognizing the implications even as Thatcher processed them. "If you help me, he can claim you're acting against the interests of the child, that you're enabling my unstable behavior. In the territories, that could mean losing your land, your livelihood." "Let him try," Thatcher said, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes, the recognition that Marcus had positioned himself cleverly within the law. "No." Sarah stood abruptly, her decision crystallizing with painful clarity. "I won't let you risk everything for someone you barely know. I'll have to go back, find another way to—" "Sit down." Thatcher's voice carried an authority that made Sarah comply without thinking. "You're not going anywhere with that man. Not while you're carrying a child, not ever." "Then what do you suggest?" Sarah's voice cracked with frustration and fear. "He has the law on his side, Thatcher. He has money and influence and apparently the patience to track me across half the country. What do we have?" Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, staring out across the snow-covered fields toward the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, as if he were working through a complex problem. "We have the truth about Thomas's death if we can prove it. We have the fact that you're not mentally incompetent, despite what his papers claim. And we have something else Marcus didn't count on." "What's that?" "We have time. This letter took weeks to reach us, which means Marcus is still operating on old information. He doesn't know exactly where you are, just that someone in this area might have taken you in. And winter makes travel difficult even for territorial marshals." Sarah felt a flicker of hope, quickly tempered by reality. "But when spring comes, we'll be ready for him. But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Thatcher folded the letter carefully, his mind already working on the challenge ahead. "Tell me everything. You remember about Thomas's suspicions, every detail about the mining operation, every conversation you had about Marcus's business dealings." As Sarah began to speak, recounting months of half-remembered conversations and growing concerns, Thatcher found himself thinking about the letter in Margaret's prayer book, the one she had written but never sent to her sister back east, the one that detailed her own suspicions about corruption in the territorial government. Margaret had always been perceptive about people's motivations, quick to spot inconsistencies in stories that didn't quite add up. The irony wasn't lost on him, that once again a woman in his care was facing threats from men who used the law as a weapon to get what they wanted, But this time, he wasn't going to stand by and let injustice prevail. This time, he had a chance to fight back. "There's something else," Sarah said suddenly, her hand going to the small cloth bag she kept pinned inside her dress. "Something I didn't tell you before, because I was afraid." She withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed and worn from handling. "Thomas gave this to me the night before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should take it to the territorial authorities. It's a list of mining claims and the amounts of gold extracted from each one compared to what was reported to the company." Thatcher studied the document, his eyes widening as he realized the implications. This shows a pattern of theft going back months. If Thomas was keeping these records, Marcus would have known. Thomas was never good at hiding his feelings when something bothered him. If he was investigating, Marcus would have seen it coming. Sarah's voice was heavy, with the weight of understanding. "I think Marcus killed my husband, Thatcher, and now he wants to silence the only person who might be able to prove it." The admission hung in the air between them, transforming what had been a legal and personal crisis into something much darker and more dangerous. But instead of the fear Sarah expected to see in Thatcher's eyes, she saw something else entirely. A steely determination that reminded her that this man had survived loss and isolation through strength of will, and that he was not easily intimidated. "Then, we'll make sure he doesn't succeed," Thatcher said simply. "But first we need help, and I know exactly where to find it." As the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the harsh realities of winter survival, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For months, she had been running. From grief, from threats, from the overwhelming weight of circumstances beyond her control. But here, in this man's steady presence and quiet determination, she was beginning to remember what it felt like to fight back. The legal summons in Thatcher's hand represented everything that had gone wrong in her life since Thomas's death. The manipulation, the powerlessness, the assumption that a woman alone had no rights worth respecting. But it also represented something else, the first real chance she'd had to confront the man who had destroyed her life and might well have murdered her husband. Marcus had made one crucial error in his calculations. He had assumed that a pregnant widow would remain isolated and helpless, that finding her would be the same as reclaiming her. He hadn't counted on her finding someone willing to stand beside her, someone with his own reasons for distrusting men who used law and custom to prey on the vulnerable. The battle ahead would be dangerous, Sarah realized. But for the first time, since Thomas's death, she felt something other than fear about the future. She felt ready to fight. 3 days after the letter arrived, Sarah's worst fears materialized in the form of a black carriage making its way across the snow-covered landscape toward Thatcher's ranch. She spotted it first from the kitchen window, where she had been kneading bread, her hands stilling in the dough as she recognized the expensive vehicle and the quality of the horses pulling it. "He's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying clearly to Thatcher, who was repairing a harness near the fireplace. Thatcher set down his work immediately and moved to the window, his jaw tightening as he took in the sight of the approaching carriage. Behind it rode 2 men on horseback, one wearing the badge of a territorial marshal, the other bearing the bearing and dress of a hired gun. Marcus Lenning, it seemed, was taking no chances with his reclamation of his sister-in-law. "Get away from the window," Thatcher said quietly. "Go upstairs and stay there until I tell you otherwise." "No." Sarah's voice was stronger than she felt. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of running. If I'm going to face him, I'd rather do it with some dignity and tact." Thatcher turned to study her face, seeing the fear there but also something else, a quiet determination that reminded him of Margaret when she had made up her mind about something. "All right," he said finally. "But stay behind me, and if things go badly, you run. Promise me that." Before Sarah could answer, the sound of carriage wheels and horses' hooves filled the yard outside. Through the window, they watched as 3 men dismounted, Marcus Lenning, every inch the successful businessman in his expensive coat and polished boots. Marshal Tom Bradley, a man Thatcher recognized by reputation as someone who followed the letter of the law, regardless of its spirit. And Jake Morrison, whose reputation was considerably darker and involved the kind of work that decent people didn't discuss in polite company. Marcus was not what Sarah had expected when she had fled Pennsylvania. In her memory, heightened by fear and grief, he had loomed larger, more physically imposing. The reality was a man of medium height and soft build, his pale features and carefully groomed appearance speaking of someone who had never known physical hardship. But his eyes, pale blue and calculating, held a coldness that made Sarah's skin crawl. The gold pocket watch that hung from his vest caught the winter sunlight as he adjusted it with the precise movements of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Everything about him spoke of wealth and authority, from his perfectly tailored clothes to the way he gestured for the other men to follow his lead. A sharp knock at the door echoed through the house, and Thatcher answered it with a calm deliberation that Sarah was beginning to recognize as his way of preparing for conflict. "Mr. Rourke." Marcus's voice carried the smooth tones of education and refinement, but underneath lay an edge of steel. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Don't believe I do," Thatcher replied evenly, not moving from the doorway. "Everything on this property is mine, legally acquired and properly maintained." "I think you misunderstand me." Marcus's smile was cold and precise. "I'm referring to my sister-in-law, Sarah Lenning, who I have reason to believe is currently residing on your property. I have here legal documentation establishing my guardianship over her and her unborn child." Marshal Bradley stepped forward, producing the same type of official papers Sarah had seen in Marcus's letter. "Mr. Rourke, I'm here in an official capacity to escort Mrs. Lenning back to Pennsylvania, where she can receive proper care from her family." "Proper care," Thatcher repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "And what makes you think she isn't receiving proper care here?" "Mr. Rourke," Marcus said, his tone taking on the patient quality of someone explaining something to a child. "Surely you can understand that a woman in Mrs. Lenning's condition requires the attention of family, of people who have her best interests at heart. I'm sure your intentions have been admirable, but a bachelor rancher living alone is hardly equipped to provide the kind of care a pregnant woman needs." "Is that so?" Thatcher stepped aside, revealing Sarah standing behind him. "Why don't you ask the lady herself what kind of care she prefers?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as Marcus's pale eyes fixed on her. She could see him taking inventory, her improved appearance, the way she carried herself with more confidence than when she had fled his household, the obvious fact that she had been well-fed and well cared for during her time at the ranch. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone of gentle concern that made her stomach turn. "My dear girl, you've led us quite a chase. We've been terribly worried about you, disappearing in the middle of winter, in your condition. When the neighbors said you had simply vanished, we feared the worst. I'm perfectly well, as you can see," Sarah replied, pleased that her voice remained steady. "And I'm exactly where I choose to be." "Choose?" Marcus's eyebrows rose in an expression of surprise that didn't reach his eyes. "My dear Sarah, I'm afraid the law doesn't recognize a woman in your circumstances as competent to make such choices. The emotional strain of Thomas's death, the pregnancy, the obvious mental distress that led you to abandon proper family support, all of these factors have been considered by the territorial authorities." He produced another set of papers from his coat. "I have here a medical assessment declaring you temporarily incompetent to manage your own affairs, signed by Dr. Harrison Whitmore of Philadelphia, a specialist in conditions affecting women's mental faculties." Sarah's face went white. "Dr. Whitmore examined me once for 10 minutes at your request. He never spoke to me about my mental state, never asked about my wishes or my circumstances. The doctor's examination was thorough and professional," Marcus replied smoothly. He noted clear signs of hysteria, emotional instability, and the kind of irrational thinking that often affects women during pregnancy. Your subsequent behavior, fleeing family support, placing yourself and your child in danger, taking up residence with a strange man, only confirms his assessment. "Now wait just a minute," Thatcher interjected, his voice carrying a warning edge. "Mrs. Lenning has been nothing but rational and competent during her stay here. She's contributed to the household, cared for herself appropriately, and made reasonable decisions about her welfare." Marshal Bradley consulted his papers again. "Mr. Rourke, I appreciate your concern, but the law is clear. Mrs. Lenning is under the legal guardianship of her brother-in-law, and any person who interferes with that guardianship can be charged with obstruction of justice and potentially kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Sarah's voice rose with outrage. "I came here of my own free will, and I'm staying of my own free will. No one has forced me to do anything." "That's not how the law sees it," Marcus said with false sympathy. "A woman declared incompetent cannot give legal consent to her circumstances. Any man who takes advantage of such a woman's condition, who provides her with shelter in exchange for companionship, is guilty of exploitation at minimum." The implication hung in the air like a poison cloud, and Sarah saw Thatcher's hands clench at his sides. The suggestion that their arrangement had been anything improper was both insulting and dangerous. In the territories, a man's reputation was everything, and the kind of scandal Marcus was implying could destroy Thatcher's standing in the community. "That's a lie," Sarah said, stepping forward despite Thatcher's restraining hand on her arm. "Mr. Rourke has been nothing but honourable. He provided shelter to someone in need, nothing more." "I'm sure that's what you believe," Marcus replied, his tone patronising. "But pregnancy can affect a woman's judgment, make her susceptible to the influence of unscrupulous men. That's precisely why the law provides for male guardianship in such circumstances." Jake Morrison, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "Seems to me we're wasting time with talk. The lady needs to come with us. The sooner the better. Winter travel's hard enough without standing around jawing all day." There was something in Morrison's tone that made both Thatcher and Sarah understand that the conversation had moved beyond legal formalities into more dangerous territory. This was a man accustomed to getting results through intimidation and force, and his patience with diplomatic approaches was clearly limited. "The marshal's got papers," Morrison continued, his hand resting casually on the butt of the gun at his hip. "Seems pretty straightforward to me. Lady comes with us, nobody. Gets hurt, everybody goes home happy. Mrs. Lenning isn't going anywhere," Thatcher said quietly, and something in his tone made Morrison's eyes sharpen with interest. "That's so?" Morrison smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "And what exactly do you figure to do about it?" "Rancher!" The tension in the air was suddenly thick enough to cut, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the situation was spiraling toward violence. Marcus had come prepared for resistance, had brought not just legal authority, but physical force to ensure he got what he wanted. "Gentlemen," Marcus interjected smoothly, "I'm sure there's no need for unpleasantness. Mr. Rourke seems like a reasonable man. I'm prepared to compensate him for any expenses he's incurred in caring for Sarah and to ensure that no legal difficulties arise from this unfortunate misunderstanding." "How generous," Thatcher replied dryly. "And what happens to Mrs. Lenning once she's back under your care?" "She'll receive the best medical attention available, proper supervision during the remainder of her pregnancy, and a comfortable home for herself and her child. As Thomas's brother, I consider it my duty to ensure his widow and child are properly provided for." But Sarah could hear what Marcus wasn't saying, could see in his pale eyes the same calculating assessment she had fled from months ago. She would be a prisoner in his household, dependent on his charity and subject to his authority in all things. And when the baby was born, What about Thomas's mining claims? She asked suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. What? About the money he had saved? The property he owned? Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Poor Sarah, still fixated on those unfortunate business dealings. I'm afraid Thomas left quite a mess behind. Debts, questionable transactions, missing equipment. The mining company was forced to seize his assets to cover the losses. But don't worry, my dear. You won't need to concern yourself with such complicated matters. That's what family is for. Sarah felt a surge of anger that burned away her fear. You mean that's what you're for? Taking what belonged to Thomas, using the law to steal from his widow and child? Sarah, Marcus said, his voice taking on a sharp edge, you're clearly overwrought. This is exactly the kind of irrational thinking Dr. Whitmore warned about. Marshal Bradley, I think we've established that Mrs. Lenning is indeed in need of immediate care. The Marshal nodded reluctantly. Mrs. Lenning, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your things. We'll be leaving within the hour. And if she refuses, Thatcher asked, then she'll be taken into custody for her own protection, Bradley replied, and you'll be arrested for interfering with a lawful guardianship. Sarah looked around the small group of men, Marcus with his cold calculation, Morrison with his casual menace, the Marshal with his reluctant but unwavering adherence to legal authority, and Thatcher with his quiet determination to protect her. Despite the odds against him, she thought of the cradle upstairs, waiting in the attic like a symbol of hope deferred. She thought of the warmth she had found in this house, the first real safety she had known since Thomas's death. And she thought of the documents hidden in her dress, the evidence that might yet prove Marcus's crimes if she could find a way to get it to the right authorities. I need a moment to gather my things, she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. Marcus smiled, the expression of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted. Of course, my dear, take all the time you need. But as Sarah turned toward the stairs, she caught Thatcher's eye and saw something there that gave her hope. He hadn't given up, hadn't accepted defeat. Whatever he was planning, she needed to be ready to help him when the moment came. The game wasn't over yet. As Sarah climbed the stairs to gather her belongings, her mind raced with desperate possibilities. She could hear the low murmur of voices. Below, Marcus's smooth tones mixing with the Marshal's official declarations and Thatcher's measured responses. But underneath it all was the silence that spoke of Morrison's presence, a predator waiting for an excuse to act. In the small room where she had slept, Sarah quickly bundled her few possessions into the cloth bag she had carried from Pennsylvania. But her real focus was on the documents hidden in her dress, Thomas's mining records that could prove Marcus's theft. If only she could find a way to get them to someone who would listen. A soft knock at the door made her freeze. "It's me," came Thatcher's low voice. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his face grim, but his eyes alert with purpose. "Listen carefully," he said quietly. "I sent Billy Henderson to town before Marcus arrived. Word should be spreading about what's happening here, and there are people in Devil's Creek who won't stand for this kind of legal bullying." "What kind of people?" Sarah whispered. "Judge Catherine Morrison, no relation to the gun hand downstairs. She's the territorial judge for this district, and she's got a reputation for being fair-minded about women's rights. More importantly, she's got the authority to review guardianship, orders and investigate irregularities in legal proceedings." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. But will she listen? Marcus has official documents, medical assessments. She'll listen if the evidence is compelling enough. "Do you still have those mining records?" Sarah nodded, her hand going instinctively to the hidden pocket in her dress. "Good. When we get to town, and we will get to town, you need to be ready to present everything you know about Thomas's death and Marcus's business dealings. But right now, we need to buy time." From downstairs came Marcus's voice, raised in impatience. "Sarah, my dear, we really must be going. The weather looks like it might turn, and I'd prefer to reach town before dark." Thatcher's expression hardened. He's right about the weather, which works in our favor. No one's traveling far in what's coming. He glanced toward the window where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. But first, we need to get the community involved. Marcus is counting on this being a private matter, something he can handle quietly. The more people who know what's happening, the harder it becomes for him to control the situation. How do we do that? Trust me. But when we go downstairs, follow my lead, and don't agree to leave until you've spoken to Judge Morrison. You have that right under territorial law, even under guardianship. They descended the stairs together to find Marcus, pacing near the fire, while Morrison lounged against the wall, and Marshal Bradley studied his papers with obvious discomfort. The Marshal, Sarah realized, was not entirely comfortable with his role in this proceeding. "Sarah," Marcus said as she appeared, "ready to go? I've arranged for comfortable accommodations in town tonight, and we can begin the journey home tomorrow." "Actually," Thatcher said before Sarah could respond, "there's a problem with that plan. Mrs. Lenning has the right to appeal her guardianship before Judge Morrison before she can be removed from the territory. That's territorial law, Marshal, and I believe you're obligated to ensure she has that opportunity." Marshal Bradley frowned, clearly caught off guard. That is, the papers I have seem to be in order. The papers establish guardianship under Pennsylvania law," Thatcher continued calmly. "But Mrs. Lenning is currently a resident of Wyoming territory, which means she's entitled to the protections of territorial law. Judge Morrison will need to review the guardianship order and determine whether it's valid under our jurisdiction." Marcus's face flushed with anger, the first crack in his composed facade. "This is ridiculous. The woman is clearly incompetent to manage her own affairs, as evidenced by her current circumstances. What territorial judge would overturn a properly executed guardianship order? One who's interested in justice rather than convenience." Came a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Dr. Samuel Harrison entering the house, followed by 3 other men Sarah didn't recognize. The doctor was an older man, with kind eyes, and the careful bearing of someone accustomed to being trusted with people's lives and secrets. "Dr. Harrison," Thatcher said with evident relief, "thank you for coming." "Billy Henderson said there was a medical emergency out here," the doctor replied, his gaze taking in the tense scene. "Something about a pregnant woman being forcibly removed from medical care?" Marcus stepped forward, his businessman's smile firmly in place. "Doctor, I'm afraid young Billy misunderstood the situation. I'm Marcus Lenning, Sarah's brother-in-law and legal guardian. I'm here to escort her back to Pennsylvania, where she can receive proper medical attention." Dr. Harrison's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew sharper. "And you are a medical professional qualified to determine what constitutes proper medical attention for Mrs. Lenning. I have arranged for the finest doctors in Philadelphia to attend her," Marcus replied smoothly. "Specialists in conditions affecting women during pregnancy, I see. And have you examined Mrs. Lenning's current condition? Reviewed her medical needs? Consulted with her current physician?" "Current physician?" Marcus's voice took on a dismissive tone. "Doctor, surely you don't consider yourself qualified to provide the kind of specialized care—" "I consider myself qualified to determine whether a patient is receiving adequate care," Dr. Harrison interrupted. "Mrs. Lenning, with your permission, I'd like to examine you and assess your current condition." Sarah nodded gratefully, and the doctor gestured toward the kitchen. "Gentlemen, if you'll excuse us for a few minutes." As the doctor and Sarah disappeared into the other room, the remaining men stood in uncomfortable silence. Morrison's hand remained casually near his weapon, but the presence of the other townsmen, Sarah could hear them talking quietly on the porch, had clearly changed the dynamic of the situation. "This is highly irregular," Marcus said to Marshal Bradley. "I have legal authority here. These people are interfering with a lawful guardianship." "Maybe so," the Marshal replied slowly. "But territorial law does give Mrs. Lenning the right to a hearing before she can be removed from the jurisdiction. And if the local doctor determines that moving her would be dangerous to her health or the babies, The doctor is hardly impartial. Marcus snapped. He's clearly been influenced by local sentiment. Has he? Thatcher asked quietly. Or is he just doing his job? Because from where I stand, it looks like you're the one trying to influence the situation with money and hired guns. Morrison straightened at the implied insult, his eyes narrowing. You want to be real careful about what you're saying, Rancher. I'm saying that in Wyoming territory, we settle our disputes through law and community consensus, not through intimidation and force. And right now, it seems like the community has some questions about your employer's methods. Through the window, Sarah could see more people arriving, men and women from town, their faces grave with concern. Word was indeed spreading, and Marcus's carefully controlled private reclamation was becoming a very public matter. Dr. Harrison emerged from the kitchen. After 20 minutes, his expression serious but calm. Mrs. Lenning is in excellent health, considering her circumstances. Her pregnancy is progressing normally, and she shows no signs of the mental instability described in these documents. He held up the papers Marcus had presented. In fact, she's remarkably composed and rational for someone who's been through the trauma she's experienced. Doctor, Marcus said through gritted teeth, I'm sure you mean well, but you're not qualified to assess mental competency. Dr. Whitmore is a specialist. Dr. Whitmore examined Mrs. Lenning for 10 minutes and reached conclusions that directly contradict what I observe after a thorough examination, Dr. Harrison replied firmly. More importantly, Mrs. Lenning has told me some very disturbing things about the circumstances of her husband's death and the subsequent seizure of her property. Things that suggest this guardianship may be based on fraudulent premises. The room erupted in tense murmurs, and Marshal Bradley looked increasingly uncomfortable with his position. Doctor, are you saying there may be criminal activity involved here? I'm saying that Mrs. Lenning has evidence that needs to be reviewed by the proper authorities before any decisions are made about her future. Evidence that suggests her husband may have been murdered to prevent him from exposing theft and corruption. In the mining operations, Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. This is preposterous. These people are filling her head with fantasies, encouraging her delusions. Thomas died in an accident, a regrettable but entirely natural consequence of dangerous work. Then you won't mind if Judge Morrison reviews the evidence, Thatcher said calmly. After all, if everything is as legitimate as you claim, an official investigation will only confirm your position. I don't have time for this nonsense, Marcus snarled. Marshal Bradley, I demand that you execute your legal authority and remove Mrs. Lenning immediately. Marshal Bradley looked around the room, at the growing crowd outside, at Dr. Harrison's professional assessment, at the evidence of community support for Sarah, and at Morrison's increasingly aggressive posture. This was no longer a simple legal matter, but something that could explode into violence if not handled carefully. Mr. Lenning, he said finally, I'm going to have to insist that we wait for Judge Morrison to review this case. Too many questions have been raised for me to act without proper judicial oversight. Marcus's face went white with fury. This is obstruction of justice, Marshal. I'll have your badge for this. Maybe so, Bradley replied steadily, but I'd rather explain to my superiors why I delayed an action than why I ignored evidence of criminal activity. Mrs. Lenning stays put until Judge Morrison can sort this out. As word spread through the gathering crowd that the immediate threat had been postponed, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had won a temporary victory, but Marcus was not the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully, and with Morrison at his side, the situation remained dangerous. That evening, as snow began to fall in earnest outside Thatcher's windows, an extraordinary thing happened in Devil's Creek. The women of the town began to organize. It started with Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the banker's wife, who had listened to Dr. Harrison's account of the day's events with growing indignation. By nightfall, she had visited every respectable household in town, and by the following morning, a petition was making its rounds. Sarah learned of this development when Dr. Harrison returned the next day, accompanied by Mrs. Hartwell and 3 other women whose determined expressions spoke of a shared resolve that transcended social boundaries. The sight of them approaching the house together, a banker's wife, a seamstress, a widow who ran the town's only boarding house, and the blacksmith's daughter, would have been remarkable under normal circumstances. Under these circumstances, it was revolutionary. Mrs. Lenning, Mrs. Hartwell said as she entered the house, her breath still steaming from the cold, "We've come to inform you that the women of Devil's Creek stand behind you in this matter. What's being done to you is an affront to every woman who has ever lost a husband or faced difficult circumstances." Sarah stared at the petition Mrs. Hartwell produced. 3 pages covered with signatures in various hands, representing nearly every adult woman in the territory. At the top, in Mrs. Hartwell's precise script, was a statement that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. "We, the undersigned women of Devil's Creek and surrounding areas, do hereby attest to the character and competency of Mrs. Sarah Lenning, and protest, in the strongest possible terms, any attempt to remove her from this territory against her will. We have observed Mrs. Lenning to be of sound mind and moral character, capable of making decisions regarding her own welfare and that of her unborn child. Furthermore, we call upon the territorial authorities to investigate the circumstances surrounding the death of her husband Thomas Lenning and the subsequent seizure of his property by parties unknown." "How did you know about Thomas's property?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Harrison told us what you shared with him," said Miss Rebecca Torres, the seamstress. "About the mining records, about your suspicions. My brother works in the Territorial Records Office, and he's always said there's been strange business with some of the mining claims out of Pennsylvania. Claims that get transferred real quick after accidents, if you know what I mean." Mrs. Catherine Woods, the boarding house proprietor, stepped forward. "I've seen women in your situation before, dear. Widows with property that suddenly becomes complicated after their husbands die. Men who show up with papers and lawyers claiming they're just looking out for the poor, helpless female." Her voice carried the bitter edge of personal experience. "It's theft, plain and simple, dressed up in legal clothes." Sarah sank into the rocking chair by the fire, overwhelmed by this unexpected show of support. "But the law, Marcus has documents, medical assessments." The territorial marshal seemed convinced. "The territorial marshal is a man doing what he thinks is his job," Mrs. Hartwell interrupted. "But Judge Morrison is a woman who understands what it means to be at the mercy of men who think they know what's best for us. When she sees this petition, when she hears your story directly from you, instead of filtered through your brother-in-law's lawyers, things might look very different." From the kitchen came the sound of Thatcher preparing coffee, and Sarah realized that throughout this conversation he had remained carefully in the background, allowing the women to speak without male interference. It was a sensitivity that spoke to his understanding of just how significant this moment was, not just for Sarah, but for every woman who had ever been told her own judgment couldn't be trusted. "There's more," said Alice Murphy, the blacksmith's daughter, a young woman with calloused hands and a direct way of speaking. "We've been asking around about this Marcus Lenning, and some interesting things have come to light. Turns out he's been through this territory before about 2 years ago, buying up mining claims from widows and families who'd lost their breadwinners in accidents." Sarah's head snapped up. "What kind of accidents?" "The kind that happened to men who ask too many questions about how the mining operations are run," Alice replied grimly. "My cousin worked some of those claims before the accidents started happening. Said there was talk among the miners about stolen equipment, false weight, reports, money that went missing from the company accounts." Mrs. Woods nodded. "And every time there was an accident, Marcus Lenning would show up within a week or two with legal papers and cash offers for the claims. Always presented himself as a concerned business partner, just trying to help out the bereaved families." "You're saying Thomas wasn't the first," Sarah said, the pieces of a larger picture beginning to fall into place. "We're saying your husband stumbled onto something much bigger than simple theft," Mrs. Hartwell replied, "and that makes your brother-in-law a very dangerous man indeed." The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the air. If Marcus had been systematically murdering miners and stealing their claims, then Sarah wasn't just an inconvenient witness to theft, she was a threat to an entire criminal enterprise. And that made her current situation far more perilous than any of them had initially realized. "Which is why," Mrs. Hartwell continued, "we're not content to simply wait for Judge Morrison to arrive. We're taking additional steps to ensure your safety and to gather evidence against Mr. Lenning." She produced another document from her reticule. "This is a letter to the territorial governor, signed by every person of standing in this community, requesting a full investigation into the mining claim transfers and the suspicious deaths associated with them. Dr. Harrison has also contacted colleagues in other territories where similar patterns may have occurred." Sarah felt a dangerous surge of hope. "Do you really think it will make a difference?" "I think," said Mrs. Woods with grim satisfaction, "that Marcus Lenning has made the mistake of assuming that frontier women are ignorant and powerless. He's about to learn otherwise." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the window. Through the falling snow, they could see Marcus's carriage returning, this time accompanied by additional riders. But instead of the intimidation factor he had clearly intended, the sight only strengthened the resolve of the women gathered in Thatcher's parlor. "Good," Mrs. Hartwell said crisply. "Let him see that Mrs. Lenning is not without allies. Alice, would you mind stepping outside and letting those gentlemen know that any attempt to harass Mrs. Lenning will be witnessed and reported to the appropriate authorities?" Alice Murphy grinned, revealing the kind of fierce pleasure that comes from finally having a legitimate target for long-suppressed anger. "My pleasure, Mum." As Alice strode toward the door, Mrs. Woods turned to Sarah with a serious expression. "Now, dear, I need you to tell us everything about those mining records you mentioned to Dr. Harrison. If we're going to build a case against your brother-in-law, we need to understand exactly what evidence we're working with." Sarah rose and retrieved the documents from their hiding place, spreading Thomas's careful notations across the kitchen table where the women could examine them. As they bent over the papers, their faces grew increasingly grave. "These numbers," Mrs. Hartwell said after several minutes of study, "if they're accurate, they show systematic theft over a period of months. This isn't opportunistic crime. This is organized fraud on a massive scale. And look at this," Miss Torres added, pointing to a series of dates. "These equipment losses all occurred within days of the miners being paid. Someone with inside knowledge was timing these thefts to maximize the financial impact." Mrs. Woods straightened, her expression grim. "Ladies, I think we're looking at evidence of murder for profit, carried out with the cooperation of corrupt officials and mining company representatives. This goes far beyond simple fraud." Outside, they could hear Alice's clear voice carrying across the yard. "Mr. Lenning, you and your associates are welcome to wait in town for Judge Morrison's arrival, but any attempt to approach this house or harass its occupants will be met with appropriate resistance." Marcus's reply was inaudible, but his tone suggested frustration and growing anger. The presence of witnesses was clearly not part of his preferred operating method. "We need to get these documents to safety," Mrs. Hartwell said decisively. "Multiple copies stored in different locations, with trusted people who can present them to the authorities if anything happens to Mrs. Lenning or the originals." "I can arrange that," Dr. Harrison said from the doorway, where he had been quietly observing. "My brother-in-law is a lawyer in Denver, and he has connections with federal marshals who investigate territorial corruption. If Mrs. Lenning consents, I can have copies of these documents in their hands within the week." Sarah looked around at the circle of determined faces, women who had their own struggles, their own concerns, but who had chosen to stand up against injustice when they saw it. The petition in Mrs. Hartwell's hands represented more than simple community support. It was a declaration that frontier women would not be silenced or ignored when their rights and safety were threatened. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Do whatever you think is necessary. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of running from the truth." Mrs. Woods smiled, the expression transforming her careworn features. "That's the spirit, dear. Fear is a luxury we can't afford when dealing with men like Marcus Lenning. But courage is something that multiplies when it's shared." As the women began making plans for document preservation and evidence gathering, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since Thomas's death, she wasn't facing her problems alone. The petition, bearing dozens of signatures, was proof that her story mattered, that her fight for justice had resonated with others who understood what it meant to be vulnerable in a world controlled by men. Marcus had made a crucial miscalculation in his assessment of frontier communities. He had assumed that isolated settlements would be easier to manipulate, that distance from established law enforcement would work in his favor. Instead, he had encountered something he hadn't expected, a community that took care of its own and didn't tolerate outside intimidation. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, Sarah began to believe they might actually win. Dr. Harrison's medical bag had seen many difficult situations over his 20 years of frontier practice, but rarely had it carried such crucial evidence as it did on the cold morning when he made his rounds through Devil's Creek. Hidden among his instruments and medicines were carefully copied documents that could expose a conspiracy of murder and theft spanning multiple territories. As he made his way from house to house, ostensibly checking on patients, but actually distributing copies of Thomas's mining records to trusted community members, the good doctor reflected on how quickly their quiet territorial dispute had escalated into something approaching warfare. His first stop was at the Hartwell house, where Eleanor waited with her husband Charles, the town's banker. Dr. Harrison had known Charles for 15 years and trusted him to understand the financial implications of what they had discovered. "These numbers are staggering," Charles said after reviewing the documents spread across his dining room table. "If Thomas Lenning's calculations are accurate, we're looking at theft in the tens of thousands of dollars. That's more money than most territorial banks see in a year, and it explains why Marcus was willing to go to such lengths to silence Sarah," Eleanor added. "A man doesn't arrange fraudulent guardianships and hire guns for a simple family dispute." Dr. Harrison nodded grimly, which brings us to our immediate problem. Sarah's pregnancy is progressing normally, but the stress of this situation is taking its toll. She needs stability and peace, not the constant threat of violence or forced removal. "What about the baby?" Charles asked. "Any complications you should know about? Not medically, but legally." Dr. Harrison paused, considering his words carefully. "If Marcus gains custody of Sarah, he'll also control the child. And a child represents the ultimate leverage over a mother. Sarah knows this, and it's affecting her more than she's willing to admit." Eleanor's expression hardened with determination. "Then we need to ensure that doesn't happen." "Charles, what are our legal options if the territorial marshal returns with more explicit orders?" Charles Hartwell had not become the territory's most successful banker without understanding how power worked, both officially and unofficially. "We need Judge Morrison here as quickly as possible, and we need evidence that can't be dismissed or suppressed. But more than that, we need to make sure Marcus understands that removing Sarah from this community will cost him more than leaving her alone." "What do you mean?" Dr. Harrison asked. "I mean we make it clear that any harm that comes to Sarah or her child will be met with consequences that extend far beyond this territory." Marcus operates through intimidation and legal manipulation, but he's still a businessman. If we can make his criminal activities more expensive than legitimate ones, he'll recalculate his approach." Eleanor leaned forward. "You're thinking of involving the Denver authorities directly. I'm thinking of involving everyone. Federal marshals, territorial governors, newspaper editors, church leaders, anyone with the authority and inclination to investigate corruption in the mining territories. Make this too public and too complicated for Marcus to handle through his usual methods." As Dr. Harrison left the Hartwell house and continued his rounds, he found the same determination in every household he visited. The women's petition had sparked something larger than simple community support. It had awakened a collective sense of justice that transcended individual concerns. At the boarding house, Mrs. Woods had prepared a room for Judge Morrison's anticipated arrival and had begun documenting everything she could remember about Marcus's previous visits to the territory. "He stayed here 2 years ago," she told Dr. Harrison as she showed him her careful notes. "Quiet man, paid in gold, asked a lot of questions about local mining families. At the time, I thought he was just a businessman looking for investment opportunities." "What changed your mind?" "The accident started happening right after he left. 3 miners died in equipment failures within a month of his visit, and their widows all sold their claims to Eastern buyers within weeks of the funerals. Seemed like an awful coincidence at the time." Dr. Harrison studied her documentation with growing appreciation for the thoroughness of frontier women when they set their minds to a task. "This is excellent work, Catherine. Combined with Thomas's records, it establishes a clear pattern of criminal activity." "More than that," Mrs. Woods replied with grim satisfaction. "It shows that Sarah's situation isn't unique. There are other widows, other families who've been victimized by this man. If we can find them, if we can get them to speak up, we'd have multiple witnesses to a conspiracy spanning several territories," Dr. Harrison finished. Marcus would face federal charges, not just territorial disputes. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the boarding house window, they could see a crowd gathering in the town's main street, their attention focused on a figure on horseback who was addressing them with obvious agitation. Dr. Harrison recognized Jake Morrison, Marcus's hired gun, and his presence in town without his employer suggested that the situation was escalating beyond Marcus's original plans. "Trouble," Mrs. Wood said quietly. They watched as Morrison gestured emphatically toward the edge of town, clearly trying to rally support for some kind of action. But the crowd's response was not what he had obviously expected. Instead of agreement, there were shouts of disagreement, hands pointing back toward Morrison himself, and the kind of body language that suggested a community closing ranks against an outsider. "He's trying to turn the town against Sarah," Dr. Harrison realized, "probably claiming she's a dangerous influence, or that harboring her puts everyone at risk. Then he's about to learn something about frontier justice," Mrs. Woods replied, with a small smile. "This community doesn't respond well to threats from strangers." Indeed, as they watched, several of the town's men began moving toward Morrison with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested his welcome was being officially withdrawn. The gunman seemed to realize his tactical error and began backing his horse away from the increasingly hostile crowd. Dr. Harrison left the boarding house and made his way toward the disturbance, arriving just as Morrison was addressing Charlie Murphy, Alice's father, and the town blacksmith. "Just saying that harboring fugitives from the law isn't something a decent community should tolerate," Morrison was saying, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun. "When the federal authorities get involved, they won't distinguish between the criminals and the people who help them." "Is that a threat?" Charlie Murphy asked, his own hands visibly empty, but his stance suggesting he was far from intimidated. "It's a warning. Marcus Lenning has connections you people can't imagine. Judges, territorial officials, federal marshals, men who don't take kindly to communities that interfere with legal proceedings. "And we," said a new voice from the crowd, "don't take kindly to hired guns who threaten our neighbors." Dr. Harrison turned to see Sheriff Tom Bradley approaching, his badge glinting in the weak winter sunlight. The sheriff's presence changed the dynamic immediately. Morrison was no longer facing an unorganized crowd, but a lawman with territorial authority. "Mr. Morrison," the sheriff continued, "I believe Mr. Lenning was informed that Mrs. Sarah Lenning would remain in this community pending Judge Morrison's review of her case. That decision hasn't changed." "Sheriff," Morrison replied, his tone carefully respectful but with an underlying edge, "I think you may be overstepping your authority here. Mr. Lenning has federal backing for his guardianship claim." "Does he? Because I've sent telegrams to the territorial capital requesting clarification on the jurisdictional issues involved, and I haven't received any confirmation of federal involvement. Until I do, Mrs. Lenning stays put." Dr. Harrison felt a surge of admiration for the sheriff's careful navigation of the legal complexities. By demanding official confirmation of federal authority, he was buying time while maintaining his own legal standing. Morrison's expression suggested he was calculating his options, none of which appeared particularly favorable. "This isn't over, Sheriff. Mr. Lenning isn't the kind of man who accepts defeat gracefully." "Then Mr. Lenning needs to understand that this isn't Pennsylvania," Sheriff Bradley replied calmly. "In Wyoming territory, we settle our disputes through proper legal channels, not through intimidation and force. If he has legitimate legal claims, Judge Morrison will review them fairly. If he doesn't..." The implied threat hung in the air, and Morrison clearly understood that his employer's tactics had backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Sarah and forcing her compliance, Marcus's heavy-handed approach had unified the community against him. As Morrison rode out of town, Dr. Harrison approached Sheriff Bradley with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for that, Tom. Things were getting tense. Just doing my job, Doc, but I have to tell you, this situation is more complicated than any of us initially realized. I've been getting reports from other territories about similar patterns, miners dying in suspicious accidents, widows losing their property to Eastern buyers, legal guardianships that don't quite add up." "How many territories?" "At least 3. That I know of, possibly more. If Mrs. Lenning's suspicions are correct, we're dealing with a criminal organization that operates across territorial boundaries. That makes it a federal matter, which complicates everything." Dr. Harrison considered the implications. "But it also means that if we can prove our case, Marcus faces much more serious consequences than simple fraud." "Exactly. Which is why Judge Morrison's review is so crucial. She needs to see not just the evidence related to Sarah's guardianship, but the broader pattern of criminal activity. If she rules in Sarah's favor and finds evidence of conspiracy, she can request federal investigation. And if she doesn't," Sheriff Bradley's expression was grim, "then we'll be dealing with federal marshals who may or may not be corrupt, territorial officials who may have been bought, and a criminal organization with the resources to make people disappear permanently." The stakes, Dr. Harrison realized, had escalated far beyond Sarah's individual situation. They were now fighting not just for one woman's freedom, but against a system of corruption that threatened the integrity of territorial law itself. As he completed his rounds and returned to Thatcher's ranch to check on his patient, Dr. Harrison reflected on how medical practice had prepared him for this kind of crisis. Healing often required cutting away diseased tissue to save the healthy parts, and sometimes the process was painful but necessary. Sarah's courage in speaking out about Thomas's death had exposed an infection in the territorial system that needed to be addressed, regardless of the immediate cost. The petition signed by the women of Devil's Creek wasn't just about protecting one pregnant widow. It was about establishing that communities would not tolerate the systematic victimization of their most vulnerable members. When he arrived at the ranch, Dr. Harrison found Sarah sitting by the fire. her hands busy with needlework, but her eyes constantly drifting toward the window. The stress of the situation was clearly affecting her, despite her outward composure. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Physically, I'm well," she replied. "But mentally, I keep thinking about what Mrs. Wood said, about other widows who've been through this. How many women have suffered because Thomas and I were too naive to understand what we were up against? You can't blame yourself for not recognizing a sophisticated criminal operation," Dr. Harrison said gently. "Even experienced law enforcement officials have been fooled by Marcus's methods. But I could have acted sooner. I could have gone too. The authorities immediately after Thomas's death instead of just running away, and likely would have been dismissed as a grieving widow with wild theories," the doctor replied. "Sarah, what you've accomplished by coming here, by finding the courage to speak out, has already saved other potential victims. The investigation that's beginning now will prevent Marcus from targeting other families." Sarah's hands stilled on her needlework. "Do you really think we can stop him?" Dr. Harrison considered his answer carefully. "I think that for the first time in his criminal career, Marcus Lenning has encountered a community that refuses to be intimidated. That's already more resistance than he's faced before, and it's clearly affecting his confidence. And if that's not enough, then we'll find another way. Because what you've started here, Sarah, this isn't just about one woman fighting for her rights. It's about establishing that justice is possible, even in remote territories, even for people without wealth or political connections. That's worth fighting for, whatever the cost." As evening approached and Thatcher returned from his own errands in town, bringing news that Judge Morrison was expected within the next few days, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, not just hope but determination. The medical bag that had brought them crucial evidence was also a symbol of healing, and perhaps that's what this entire community needed. The chance to heal from the corruption that had infected their system of justice. The battle ahead would be difficult, but they were no longer fighting it alone. That evening, as Sarah sat by the fire mending one of Thatcher's shirts, a domestic task that had become both soothing and symbolically significant, she was surprised to see him enter the parlor carrying something small wrapped in a cloth. The day had been full of tension and community meetings, but now, in the quiet of their shared space, something different seemed to be stirring between them. "Sarah," Thatcher said, his voice carrying an unusual formality that made her look up from her needlework. "I've been thinking about our situation, about the legal challenges we're facing with Marcus." She set down her sewing, sensing that this conversation would be more significant than their usual evening discussions. "What about them?" Thatcher remained standing, his hands working the wrapped object with obvious nervousness. "Dr. Harrison mentioned something today that got me thinking. He said that a woman's legal standing changes considerably when she's married, that a husband has the authority to make decisions about his wife's welfare that supersede other family claims." Sarah's heart began to beat faster, though she wasn't entirely sure why. "Yes, that's generally true under territorial law," and he also mentioned that Marcus's guardianship claim would be much weaker if you were under the protection of a husband rather than living as an unmarried woman in my household. The careful way he said unmarried woman made Sarah realize how precarious their arrangement had become in the eyes of the law and community. What had felt natural and proper to them might appear quite different to officials looking for reasons to question her judgment or his motives. "Thatcher, what are you saying?" He moved to the chair across from her, still holding the wrapped object. In the firelight, his face showed the kind of vulnerability she had glimpsed only rarely. When he spoke of Margaret and Emma, when he had helped her through her medical crisis, when he had stood up to Marcus and his hired gun. "I'm saying that I think we should get married," he said simply. "For legal protection, for your safety, for the baby's future." The words hung in the air between them, and Sarah found herself studying his face for clues about his deeper feelings. A proposal for legal protection was pragmatic and sensible, but something in his expression suggested there might be more to his motivation than simple strategy. "A marriage of convenience," she said carefully, "if that's what you want to call it." Thatcher's voice was quiet, but there was something in his tone that suggested he might hope for a different classification. "Though I have to say, Sarah, that these past weeks, having you here, sharing meals and conversations, watching you bring life back to this house, it hasn't felt particularly convenient." "What has it felt like?" Thatcher was quiet for a long moment, his hands still working the cloth-wrapped object. "It's felt like coming back to life after a long illness. Like remembering what it means to care about someone, to worry about their welfare, to look forward to seeing them at the end of each day." Sarah's breath caught at the honesty in his words. "Thatcher, I know it's not romantic," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "I know you married Thomas for love, and I'm not asking you to pretend that what we have is the same thing. But I also know that what we have is real, whatever we choose to call it. And I know that I want to protect you and your child, not just from Marcus, but from anyone who might try to harm you." He unwrapped the object in his hands, revealing a simple gold band that caught the firelight with quiet beauty. "This was my mother's ring. Margaret never wore it. She wanted her own, something that was just ours. But Mother always said it was. Meant for a woman who needed strength more than luxury." Sarah stared at the ring, her mind racing with the implications of what he was proposing. Marriage to Thatcher would indeed solve many of their legal problems. Marcus's guardianship claim would be invalidated. Their living arrangement would become socially acceptable, and her child would have the protection of a father's name. But more than that, it would formalize something that had already begun to grow between them during these weeks of shared danger and domestic intimacy. "What about Margaret?" she asked softly. "What about your grief, your memories of her?" Thatcher's expression grew thoughtful. "Margaret would have liked you, Sarah. She would have understood that love isn't diminished by being shared, that the heart has room for more than one kind of caring. And she would have wanted me to be happy, to find purpose again. And would you be happy?" "I think," Thatcher said carefully, "that I already am. Happier than I've been in 3 years anyway. You've brought something to this house that I didn't realize was missing. Not just warmth and conversation, but hope. The sense that the future might hold good things instead of just empty days." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the gentle honesty of his words. "I care about you too, Thatcher. More than I expected to, more than I probably should after such a short time." "Then marry me," he said simply. "Not because you have to, not because it's the practical solution to our problems, but because you want to build something together. Because you think we might be able to make each other happy." The proposal was everything Sarah hadn't known she wanted. Honest rather than passionate, based on proven compatibility rather than romantic promises, offered by a man who had already shown her his character through his actions rather than his words. It was the proposal of a mature man to a woman who had learned the difference between infatuation and genuine partnership. "Yes," she said, the word coming out more easily than she had expected. "Yes, I'll marry you." Thatcher's face transformed with a smile that was equal parts relief and joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and Sarah was surprised by how right it felt. Not foreign or uncomfortable, but like something that had been waiting for the proper moment to find its place. "There's one more thing," Thatcher said as he settled back in his chair. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it properly. I want a real wedding, with the community present, with Dr. Harrison officiating, with all the legal documentation that Marcus can't challenge. I want everyone to understand that this isn't a desperate arrangement but a genuine commitment." "Won't that seem rushed? We've only known each other a few weeks." "Frontier marriages happen quickly," Thatcher replied with a slight smile. "People here understand that when you find someone who fits your life, you don't wait around for social conventions. Besides, I have a feeling that Mrs. Hartwell and the other women would be delighted to plan a wedding. It would give them something positive to focus on while we wait for Judge Morrison." Sarah laughed, imagining Eleanor Hartwell's reaction to the news. "I think you're right about that. She does love a project. And it would send a clear message to Marcus that you have the full support of this community, not just as a temporary guest but as a permanent member. A married woman with a husband willing to defend her has very different legal standing than a widow under someone else's guardianship." The strategic implications were indeed significant, but as Sarah looked at the ring on her finger and at Thatcher's face in the firelight, she found herself thinking less about legal protection and more about the unexpected happiness that had found her in the midst of crisis. Thomas had been the love of her youth, passionate and romantic and full of dreams about their future together. Thatcher offered something different but equally valuable: stability, companionship, and the kind of deep affection that grew from shared experience rather than shared dreams. "When?" she asked. "As soon as it can be arranged. This weekend, if possible. Dr. Harrison is qualified to perform marriages, and I suspect half the territory will want to attend just to show their support. And after, when this crisis with Marcus is resolved." Thatcher considered the question seriously. "Then we figure out how to be married, how to raise your child together, how to build the kind of life that honors both our pasts and our future. It won't always be easy, but I think we're both strong enough to handle whatever comes." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her like a warm blanket. "I think so too." Outside, the wind picked up again, reminding them both of the harsh realities that surrounded their small island of warmth and safety. Marcus was still out there, still plotting, still dangerous. Judge Morrison had yet to arrive, and the legal battle ahead remained uncertain. But inside, by the fire that had become the heart of their shared domestic life, two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and danger were planning a future together. The ring on Sarah's finger caught the light as she returned to her mending. But now the domestic task felt different, not just a way to pass time, but a symbol of the life they were choosing to build together. When she finished repairing the shirt and folded it carefully, she was no longer just a temporary guest, making herself useful, but a woman preparing to become a permanent part of this household. "Thatcher," she said, as they prepared to retire for the evening, "thank you for everything, but especially for asking rather than just assuming what I needed." "Thank you for saying yes," he replied, "and for being brave enough to believe that we might make this work." As Sarah settled into her makeshift bed that night, perhaps for the last time, she found herself thinking not about the past or the dangers that surrounded them, but about the future. In a few days, she would be Mrs. Thatcher Rourke, with all the protection and responsibility that name would bring. But more than that, she would be part of a partnership based on mutual respect, shared hardship, and the kind of quiet love that promised to grow stronger with time. The simple gold band on her finger was proof that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could take root and flourish. Tomorrow would bring wedding plans and continued resistance to Marcus's schemes. But tonight it was enough to know that she was no longer facing the future alone. The news of Sarah and Thatcher's engagement spread through Devil's Creek with the speed of wildfire. And by the following morning, Eleanor Hartwell was standing on their doorstep with a determined expression and an armload of fabric samples. Behind her came a parade of women, carrying everything from wildflowers to recipe cards, their faces bright with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from having a joyous project to offset the tension of recent events. "My dear Sarah," Eleanor announced, as she swept into the house, "we have exactly 3 days to plan a proper wedding, and I refuse to let the circumstances diminish what should be a celebration of hope and love, conquering adversity." Sarah found herself both amused and touched by the invasion of helpful neighbors In Pennsylvania, her wedding to Thomas had been a modest affair arranged by his family, with little input from Sarah herself. But this felt different, a community coming together to create something beautiful in defiance of the darkness that threatened them. "Mrs. Hartwell," Sarah said gently, "I appreciate the gesture, but given our circumstances, perhaps something simple would be more appropriate." "Nonsense," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "Marcus Lenning needs to see that you're not just surviving here, you're thriving. That this community doesn't just tolerate your presence, we celebrate it. A beautiful wedding sends exactly that message." Behind Eleanor, Alice Murphy nodded enthusiastically. "Besides, we need something good to focus on while we wait for Judge Morrison. Better to channel our energy into wedding preparations than sitting around worrying about what Marcus might do next." As the women began spreading fabric samples across every available surface, Sarah realized they were right. A wedding would indeed send a powerful message, not just to Marcus, but to anyone who might question the legitimacy of her place in this community. More than that, it would give her neighbors a chance to demonstrate their support in a concrete public way. "What did you have in mind?" Sarah asked, allowing herself to be drawn into their enthusiasm. "A dress, first and foremost," said Miss Rebecca Torres, the seamstress, her practiced eye already assessing Sarah's figure. "I have some beautiful ivory silk that would complement your coloring perfectly, and with the proper adjustments for your condition, we can create something that will make you feel like the bride you deserve to be." Mrs. Catherine Woods held up a delicate lace veil. "This belonged to my daughter. She wore it for her wedding in Denver last year. She specifically asked me to save it for someone who needed a touch of beauty in difficult circumstances." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the generosity of these women who had known her for such a short time, but were willing to share their most precious possessions to ensure her wedding day would be special. "I can't accept such valuable—" "You can and you will," Mrs. Woods interrupted gently. "That's what community means, dear. We share our joys and sorrows, our treasures and our troubles. Your happiness matters to us." As the women continued their planning, discussing flowers, food, music, and decorations, Sarah began to understand that this wedding was about more than just her union with Thatcher. It was a statement of defiance against Marcus's attempts to isolate and control her, a declaration that she belonged to this community and it belonged to her. Eleanor spread a piece of paper across the kitchen table, revealing a detailed list written in her precise handwriting. "Now for the ceremony itself. Dr. Harrison will officiate, of course, and we'll hold it in the church. Sheriff Bradley has offered to ensure security. Not that we expect trouble, but it's better to be prepared." "Security?" Sarah asked, sudden anxiety clouding her enthusiasm. "Just a precaution," Alice assured her. "Marcus has been asking questions around town, trying to find out when the ceremony will take place. We want to make sure he understands that any attempt to disrupt your wedding will be met with appropriate resistance." The reminder of Marcus's presence cast a temporary shadow over the festive planning, but Eleanor was quick to redirect attention back to positive details. "The important thing is that this wedding represents a new beginning, not just for you and Thatcher, but for all of us. We're proving that community can triumph over corruption, that love and mutual support are stronger than intimidation and greed." From the other room came the sound of Thatcher's voice as he discussed practical arrangements with several of the town's men who had arrived to offer their assistance. Sarah could hear talk of additional security, legal documentation, and witness statements, the practical underpinnings that would make their marriage legally unassailable. "What about flowers?" Miss Torres asked, bringing Sarah's attention back to the immediate preparations. "It's winter, of course, but Mrs. Patterson has some beautiful evergreen arrangements, and I believe the church still has some dried flowers from autumn decorations." "Actually," said a new voice from the doorway, "I might be able to help with that." Everyone turned to see Thatcher entering the kitchen, his arms full of something wrapped in canvas. When he unwrapped it, gasps of delight filled the room. Inside were branches of mountain laurel and pine, carefully preserved with some of the last wildflowers of autumn, all arranged with an artistic eye that spoke of careful planning. I went up to the high meadows this morning, he explained, his cheeks slightly red from cold and embarrassment. Thought Sarah might like some flowers that weren't store-bought or dried. These should last through the ceremony if we keep them cool. Sarah stared at the beautiful arrangements, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. Here was a man who had ridden miles in bitter cold to find fresh flowers for her wedding, not because it was expected or required, but because he wanted her day to be beautiful. "They're perfect," she whispered, touching one of the delicate petals. Thomas always said that wildflowers were more beautiful than cultivated ones because they chose where to bloom. Eleanor clapped her hands together with satisfaction. "Excellent! That settles the decoration question. Now, about the dress fitting. Rebecca, how quickly can you have alterations completed?" As the women launched into detailed discussions of seamstress schedules and fabric logistics, Sarah found herself drawn to the window, where she could see more neighbors arriving with contributions to the wedding preparations. Charlie Murphy was unloading chairs from his wagon, while Dr. Harrison carried what appeared to be medical supplies, presumably a precaution given her pregnancy and the stress of recent events, but it was the sight of children playing in the snow outside that brought tears to her eyes. For the first time since Thomas's death, she was surrounded by the kind of normal, joyful activity that made life worth living. These people weren't just helping her fight Marcus. They were helping her build a new life, a better life than she had dared to hope for during those dark months of grief and flight. "Sarah," Thatcher said quietly, appearing beside her at the window, "are you having second thoughts? This is all happening very quickly." She turned to study his face, seeing in his expression the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that she felt. "Are you? Not about marrying you," he said firmly, "but I want to make sure this is what you want, not just what circumstances are forcing on you. When the crisis with Marcus is over, when you're safe and free to make your own choices, I want you to be glad you said yes." Sarah reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers as she had grown accustomed to doing during their evening conversations. "Thatcher, I've learned something about myself these past weeks. I'm stronger than I thought I was, but I'm also not meant to be alone. Thomas was gone before I realized how much I needed partnership, companionship, someone to share both burdens and joys. And you think we can have that? I think we already do. The wedding will just make it official." Behind them, the women continued their animated planning, their voices mixing with the sounds of men arranging furniture and children playing outside. It was the kind of communal effort that happened naturally in frontier communities when neighbors faced shared challenges, but it felt like something more, a celebration of the possibility that good things could emerge from difficult circumstances. Eleanor approached them with a satisfied expression. "Everything is arranged. The ceremony will be Saturday afternoon, which gives us time for all the preparations and allows word to spread to the surrounding ranches. Half the territory will be here to witness your vows." "Half the territory?" Sarah repeated, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what they were planning. "Including some very important people," Eleanor continued with obvious satisfaction. "Judge Morrison sent word that she'll arrive Friday evening specifically to attend the wedding. She's quite interested in meeting you, Sarah, and in understanding the community support you've received." The news that Judge Morrison would be present for the wedding was both reassuring and nerve-wracking. On one hand, it meant that their marriage would be witnessed by the very person who would decide Sarah's legal fate. On the other hand, it added considerable pressure to an already emotionally charged event. "That's good news," Thatcher said, though Sarah could hear the tension in his voice. "It means we'll have official legal oversight of the proceedings. And it means Marcus will have to be very careful about any disruptions he might be planning," Alice added with grim satisfaction. "Even he won't want to cross a territorial judge in front of half the territory's residents." As the afternoon wore on and the preparations took shape around them, Sarah began to feel something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death. Anticipation for the future rather than dread. The borrowed wedding dress taking shape under Rebecca's skilled hands was more than just clothing. It was a symbol of new beginnings, of the possibility that love could indeed triumph over loss and fear. The community's investment in their wedding was creating something larger than a simple ceremony. It was establishing Sarah's place in Devils, Greek not as a temporary refugee, but as a permanent resident with rights and relationships that Marcus couldn't simply dissolve with legal papers. By evening, when the last of the helpers had departed and the house had returned to its usual quiet, Sarah and Thatcher found themselves sitting by the fire, surrounded by the evidence of their neighbours' generosity: fabric samples, flower arrangements, food contributions, and detailed lists of everything still to be accomplished. "Are you ready for this?" Thatcher asked. Gesturing at the organized chaos around them, Sarah looked at the wedding dress hanging carefully on a peg near the fire, at the wildflowers Thatcher had gathered for her, at the ring on her finger that caught the firelight with quiet promise. "I'm ready," she said, and realized she meant it completely. In 3 days, she would become Mrs. Thatcher Rourke in front of half the territory, with Judge Morrison as witness and the full support of a community that had chosen to stand with her against Marcus's threats. It was more protection and more happiness than she had dared to hope for, and it was all becoming real with startling speed. The borrowed wedding dress would make her beautiful, but the community's support would make her strong, and that, she realized, was exactly what she needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline winter light that made the snow-covered landscape sparkle like scattered diamonds. Sarah woke to the sound of activity throughout the house. Eleanor Hartwell had arrived before sunrise with a small army of helpers, and the kitchen was already filled with the aromas of wedding breakfast and last-minute preparations. "The bride stays in bed until we're ready for her," Eleanor announced firmly when Sarah attempted to rise and help with the preparations. "Today you are not lifting a finger. That's what the rest of us are here for." From her place by the window, Sarah could see wagons and riders arriving from all directions. Neighbors from distant ranches, townspeople in their finest clothes, even some faces she didn't recognize who had apparently traveled considerable distances to witness the ceremony. The sight filled her with equal measures of gratitude and nervous anticipation. Alice Murphy appeared in the doorway, carrying a breakfast tray. "Eat," she commanded with characteristic directness. "Rebecca needs you to have some color in your cheeks for the dress fitting. And Dr. Harrison says the baby needs proper nutrition, regardless of wedding day nerves." As Sarah dutifully consumed eggs and toast she barely tasted, the house around her hummed with purposeful activity. Through the thin walls, she could hear Eleanor directing traffic, Rebecca making last-minute alterations, and the sound of furniture being rearranged to accommodate the post-ceremony celebration. "Where's Thatcher?" Sarah asked, suddenly realizing. She hadn't seen her intended groom since the previous evening. "Charlie Murphy dragged him off to the boarding house," Alice replied with a grin. "Said it was bad luck for the groom to see the bride on the wedding day before the ceremony. Also said Thatcher looked like he needed a stiff drink and some advice from married men." The thought of Thatcher receiving matrimonial guidance from the rough-hewn but good-hearted men of Devil's Creek made Sarah smile despite her nerves. She wondered if he was experiencing the same mixture of anticipation and unreality that was making her feel as though she were watching someone else's life unfold. By mid-morning, the house had been transformed. The parlor had been cleared and decorated with Thatcher's wildflower arrangements, while the kitchen overflowed with food contributions from every household in the territory. The borrowed wedding dress hung ready, its ivory silk gleaming in the winter sunlight, while Catherine Woods's delicate veil waited nearby, like a cloud of dreams made tangible. "Time for the transformation," Rebecca announced, appearing with her sewing kit and a determined expression. "Ladies, if you would clear the room except for Eleanor and Alice, The bride needs space to prepare. What followed was an hour of careful attention that made Sarah feel more beautiful than she had since her first wedding. The ivory silk dress fit perfectly despite the necessary accommodations for her pregnancy, creating elegant lines that emphasized her natural grace while providing comfortable support. The veil, when Alice carefully arranged it over her dark hair, created an ethereal frame for her face that made her eyes appear larger and more luminous. "Oh, my dear," Eleanor breathed when the transformation was complete. "You look absolutely radiant." Sarah studied herself in the small mirror they had brought from the bedroom, hardly recognizing the composed, beautiful woman who looked back at her. The dress, the veil, and the careful attention of her friends had created something magical. Not just a bride, but a woman who appeared confident, protected, and genuinely happy. "Thatcher is going to forget how to speak," Alice said with satisfaction, "which might actually be an improvement in some ways." The sound of church bells ringing across the snowy landscape announced that the ceremony was about to begin. Through the window, Sarah could see the steady stream of people making their way toward the small wooden church, their dark clothing creating moving dots against the white ground. "Judge Morrison arrived an hour ago," Eleanor reported as she made final adjustments to Sarah's veil. "She's already inside the church, and I must say she seems quite interested in the circumstances surrounding this wedding." She asked several pointed questions about Marcus's claims and the community's response. "Is that good or bad?" Sarah asked, her stomach fluttering with new anxiety. "Good," Alice said firmly. "Judge Morrison has a reputation for being fair but thorough. If she's asking questions about Marcus, it means she's not simply accepting his version of events at face value." A knock at the door announced the arrival of Dr. Harrison, resplendent in his finest black suit and carrying his medical bag despite the festive occasion. "The bride looks absolutely beautiful," he said with genuine warmth. "Are you ready to become Mrs. Thatcher Rourke?" Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the simple gold ring already on her finger and thinking about the man who had given it to her. A man who had offered her safety, companionship, and the quiet promise of a shared future built on mutual respect and growing affection. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it completely. The walk to the church was like something from a dream. Every step of the way, Sarah was surrounded by neighbors and friends who had chosen to support her against the forces that threatened her safety and happiness. Children threw handfuls of dried flower petals despite the cold. Women called out blessings and good wishes, and men nodded respectfully as she passed. But it was the sight that greeted her at the church that truly took her breath away. Every pew was filled, and people stood along the walls and even outside the open doors, despite the bitter cold. At the front of the church, she could see Thatcher waiting beside Dr. Harrison, his face transformed by a smile that made him appear years younger. The wedding rings they would exchange lay on a small table near the altar, his mother's simple gold band that Sarah already wore, and a broader ring of the same metal that would mark Thatcher as a married man. Beside the rings sat an unexpected addition, a small bouquet of the wildflowers Thatcher had gathered, carefully preserved and bound with ribbon donated by one of the townswomen. Judge Morrison sat in the front pew, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the ceremony and the community response. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested she was accustomed to making important decisions under pressure. Her presence lent an official weight to the proceedings that made Sarah feel both protected and scrutinized. As Sarah walked down the aisle on Dr. Harrison's arm, the doctor serving as both efficient and surrogate father in the absence of her own family, she could see Marcus Lenning standing at the very back of the church. His presence was like a cold shadow in the midst of warmth and celebration, but the fact that he hadn't dared to object or interfere spoke to the power of community. Solidarity. Morrison stood beside Marcus, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun despite the sacred setting. But surrounding them were dozens of Devil's Creek residents whose own hands rested just as meaningfully on their own weapons. The message was clear. Any disruption would be met with immediate and overwhelming response. When Sarah reached the altar and turned to face Thatcher, the rest of the church seemed to fade away. Here was the man who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, who had defended her against legal and physical threats, who had offered her not just protection, but partnership. His brown eyes held warmth, determination, and something that looked very much like love. Not the passionate romance of her youth, but the deeper affection that came from shared trials and mutual respect. "Dearly beloved," Dr. Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two people who have found strength in each other during difficult times and who choose to face the future together as husband and wife." The familiar words of the marriage ceremony took on special meaning in their circumstances, when they spoke of taking each other for better or worse, in sickness and in health. Sarah knew they both understood exactly what those promises meant. They had already seen each other at their most vulnerable and had chosen to offer support rather than judgment. "Do you, Thatcher, take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love, honor, and protect her for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Thatcher said, his voice steady and sure. "Do you, Sarah, take Thatcher to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love, honor, and stand with him for as long as you both shall live?" Sarah looked into Thatcher's eyes and saw their entire shared future reflected there. Quiet, domestic happiness. The raising of her child as their own, the slow building of trust and affection into something deeper and more lasting. "I do." The exchange of rings was both simple and profound. When Thatcher placed the broader gold band on his finger beside Sarah's original ring, she felt the symbolic weight of their commitment settling around them like a protective barrier against the world's uncertainties. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming," Dr. Harrison announced with obvious satisfaction, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Thatcher, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, respectful, and full of promise. The kiss of two people who understood that they were beginning a journey together rather than simply concluding a ceremony. When they turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, the church erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to make the very walls shake with joy. As they walked back down the aisle together, Sarah caught sight of Judge Morrison's face. The territorial judge was studying them with obvious approval, her expression suggesting that she had seen exactly what she needed to see about the legitimacy of their union and the community support behind it. But it was Marcus's face that truly satisfied Sarah. Gone was the calculated confidence he had displayed during his earlier visits. Instead, she saw the frustrated rage of a man whose carefully laid plans had been completely thwarted by forces he hadn't anticipated. The legal guardianship he had counted on was now meaningless. His ability to control Sarah's circumstances had been eliminated, and he faced a territorial judge who was clearly skeptical of his motives. Outside the church, in the crisp winter, air filled with congratulations and laughter, Sarah Rourke, no longer Sarah Lenning, felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death: complete security. She was no longer a vulnerable widow at the mercy of corrupt relatives and legal manipulation. She was a married woman with a husband willing to defend her, a community that had embraced her, and legal standing that Marcus couldn't challenge. The borrowed wedding dress had served its purpose, but more than that, it had symbolized how completely she had been accepted into this new life. The rings they wore were proof of their commitment, but the faces surrounding them, neighbors who had become family, friends who had risked their own safety to protect hers, were proof that some bonds couldn't be broken by legal papers or criminal schemes. As Thatcher helped her into the wagon for the short ride back to what was now truly their home, Sarah looked back at the church, filled with people celebrating their happiness. Marcus and Morrison were nowhere to be seen, but Judge Morrison was. speaking intently with Sheriff Bradley, their expressions suggesting that official business was already beginning. "How do you feel, Mrs. Rourke?" Thatcher asked as they settled together for the ride home. Sarah tested the name, finding that it felt natural and right. "I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said. "For the first time in months, I feel like I'm home." The wedding reception that followed would be remembered in Devil's Creek for years to come. But what Sarah would always remember most was that moment of perfect clarity, sitting beside her new husband, surrounded by friends who had become family, finally safe from the threats that had driven her across half the country to find sanctuary. She was no longer running from her past, but building toward her future. And that made all the difference in the world. The wedding reception was in full swing when Judge Morrison approached Sarah with a request that would change everything. The territorial judge had spent the better part of an hour observing the celebration, speaking quietly with various community members and studying the documents that Dr. Harrison had discreetly provided. Now, as the evening shadows lengthened and the last of the toasts had been offered, she drew Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Mrs. Rourke," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of her office, but tempered with genuine concern. "I need to examine the evidence you've mentioned regarding your late husband's death and your brother-in-law's business dealings. The documents Dr. Harrison showed me suggest a pattern of criminal activity that extends far beyond your individual case." Sarah felt her stomach tighten with nervous anticipation. This was the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading. The chance to present Thomas's carefully documented evidence to someone with the power to act on it, but also the moment when Marcus would finally understand the full scope of the threat she represented to his criminal enterprise. "Of course, Your Honor, but perhaps we should speak privately. I have additional documents that Marcus doesn't know I possess, and if he realizes their significance—" Judge Morrison nodded grimly. "I've already taken the precaution of having Sheriff Bradley place Mr. Lenning and his associate under surveillance. They won't be leaving Devil's Creek until this matter is resolved. Shall we retire to a more private setting?" Within minutes, a small group had gathered in Thatcher's parlor. Sarah and Thatcher, Judge Morrison, Dr. Harrison, Sheriff Bradley, and Eleanor Hartwell, who had been specifically requested by the judge as a representative of the community's interests. The contrast between the continuing celebration outside and the serious business inside created an almost surreal atmosphere. Sarah retrieved Thomas's mining records from their hiding place, along with several additional documents she had kept, secret even from Thatcher. As she spread them across the kitchen table, Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly grave. "These are Thomas's original calculations showing the discrepancies between actual gold extraction and reported amounts," Sarah explained, pointing to the carefully annotated figures. "But this is what I haven't shown anyone else." She produced a leather portfolio that had been sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, a hiding place so secure that even during her most desperate moments she hadn't dared to examine its contents thoroughly. Inside were documents that made everyone in the room draw sharp breaths of surprise. "Partnership agreements," Judge Morrison said, reading the top document. "Between Marcus Lenning and, my God, these are territorial officials, mining commissioners, territorial marshals, even a federal judge." Thomas's husband's mining claim deed lay at the center of the evidence, but it was much more than a simple property document. Attached to it were correspondence and contracts that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy Marcus had been operating, a network of corruption that stretched across multiple territories and involved some of the highest-ranking officials in the region. Thomas discovered that Marcus wasn't just stealing from individual miners, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she revealed secrets she had carried for months. He was coordinating with territorial officials to systematically defraud mining operations, using his position as a helpful relative to gain access to claims and then working with corrupt officials to transfer ownership through fraudulent legal proceedings. Sheriff Bradley studied one of the documents with obvious shock. This shows payments to Marshal Patterson in Colorado Territory. I know Patterson. He's been investigating suspicious mining accidents for 2 years, but apparently he's been investigating on behalf of the people causing them. It gets worse, Sarah said, producing another set of papers. Thomas documented at least 12 suspicious deaths across 3 territories, all following the same pattern. Miners who asked questions about discrepancies in their claims died in accidents, and their widows were immediately approached by Marcus with offers to purchase their claims at below-market rates. Judge Morrison's face had gone pale as she absorbed the implications. This isn't just theft or even murder. This is a conspiracy to defraud the territorial government itself. The corruption extends to federal appointees, which makes this a matter for federal prosecutors, which explains why Marcus was so desperate to discredit me, Sarah added. As long as I remained silent, or could be dismissed as a hysterical widow, the evidence died with Thomas. But if I were to present this information to honest authorities, his entire operation would collapse, Thatcher finished grimly, and everyone involved would face federal charges, including treason. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a physical presence. Sarah had known that Marcus was dangerous, but the full scope of his criminal network was staggering. No wonder he had been willing to go to such lengths to gain control over her. She possessed evidence that could destroy not just him, but dozens of corrupt officials across the Western Territories. Mrs. Rourke, Judge Morrison said formally, I'm going to ask you to make these documents available for federal investigation. I'll also need you to provide sworn testimony about everything you know regarding this conspiracy. Are you prepared to do that? Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her family and protectors. Yes, Your Honor, but I want assurances about my safety and the safety of my child. If Marcus realizes what we've discovered, he won't have the opportunity to act on that knowledge, Sheriff Bradley interjected. I'm placing him under arrest, immediately, along with Morrison and anyone else who's been assisting him. Federal marshals are already en route. I sent word yesterday when Dr. Harrison first showed me these documents. You've known about this since yesterday? Sarah asked in surprise. Suspected, the sheriff corrected. The pattern was too obvious once we started looking at it objectively. But we needed you to verify the evidence and provide context for what Thomas had discovered. Your testimony will be crucial to any successful prosecution. Judge Morrison gathered the documents carefully, her expression reflecting the gravity of what they had uncovered. This will require testimony before a federal grand jury, Mrs. Rourke. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and potential danger? Sarah felt Thatcher's hand close over hers, warm and reassuring. Around her sat people who had risked their own safety to protect her, who had stood up to corruption and intimidation, not because they had to, but because it was right. The borrowed wedding dress she wore was proof of their acceptance, but more than that, it was proof of their commitment to justice over convenience. I'm prepared, she said firmly. Thomas died trying to expose this conspiracy. The least I can do is finish what he started. Eleanor Hartwell, who had been listening with growing indignation, spoke up for the first time. Judge Morrison, what can the rest of us do to support Mrs. Rourke during this process? This community isn't going to stand by and let her face federal prosecutors and corrupt officials alone. Your support has already been invaluable, Judge Morrison replied. The community backing Mrs. Rourke has received will be crucial evidence that she's competent, credible, and protected. But I have to warn you all, when news of this investigation becomes public, there will likely be attempts to discredit not just Mrs. Rourke, but this entire community. Let them try, Dr. Harrison said quietly. This territory has been dealing with corruption and outside intimidation for too long. If Mrs. Rourke's courage can help clean up the system, then we'll stand with her whatever the cost. As the meeting concluded and the group began to disperse, Sarah found herself both exhilarated and terrified by what they had set in motion. The evidence that had weighed on her conscience for months was finally in the hands of people who could act on it, but that also meant that the dangerous game she had been playing with Marcus was about to escalate dramatically. "Are you ready?" "And for this?" Thatcher asked as they prepared to rejoin their wedding celebration outside. Sarah looked down at the simple gold ring on her finger, thinking about the journey that had brought her from desperate widow to protected wife to potential key witness in a federal corruption case. "I don't think anyone can be ready for something like this," she said honestly, "but I'm not facing it alone anymore, and that makes all the difference." Outside, their neighbors continued celebrating the marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement but had become something much deeper. But inside, in the quiet of their parlor, they had just triggered a chain of events that would expose one of the largest corruption scandals in territorial history. The mining claim deed that had started as simple evidence of theft had revealed itself to be the key to a vast criminal conspiracy. Thomas's death had not been an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign of murder and fraud that had victimized dozens of families across the Western Territories. As Sarah rejoined her wedding reception, she carried with her the knowledge that her fight with Marcus was about to become much larger and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But she also carried the knowledge that she was no longer a vulnerable widow at the mercy of corrupt relatives. She was a married woman with a community behind her and evidence that could bring justice not just for Thomas, but for all the other victims of Marcus's criminal enterprise. The borrowed wedding dress that had symbolized her acceptance into the community would soon represent something even more significant: the transformation of a victim into an instrument of justice. And that, Sarah realized, was exactly what Thomas would have wanted. The arrest came at dawn the following morning, swift and decisive in the way that Sheriff Bradley had learned was necessary when dealing with dangerous criminals. Sarah woke to the sound of horses and urgent voices, and by the time she had dressed and reached the window, she could see Marcus Lenning being led away in shackles, his expensive clothes disheveled, and his face twisted with rage and disbelief. Jake Morrison had not gone quietly. The sound of gunfire before dawn had awakened half the town, and Dr. Harrison was already tending to a wounded deputy when Sarah and Thatcher arrived at the jail. Morrison lay dead in the street, his hand still reaching for the gun that had ultimately failed him, while Marcus sat in the town's single cell, his pale eyes burning with the kind of hatred that comes from complete defeat. "Federal marshals arrived 2 hours ago," Sheriff Bradley explained as they gathered in his office. "When we went to arrest Lenning and Morrison opened fire. The marshals returned fire, and that was the end of it." Judge Morrison, who had worked through the night, coordinating with federal authorities, looked exhausted but grimly satisfied. "The evidence Mrs. Rourke provided has already resulted in arrest warrants for 12 territorial officials across 3 different regions. This conspiracy was even larger than we initially realized." Sarah stared through the window at Marcus's expensive carriage, now abandoned and serving as a stark reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. Yesterday, he had been a powerful man with connections and resources that seemed unassailable. Today, he was a federal prisoner facing charges that could result in death by hanging. "What happens now?" Thatcher asked, his arm protectively around Sarah's shoulders. "Mrs. Rourke will need to provide formal testimony to a federal grand jury." "In Denver," Judge Morrison replied. "Her evidence is crucial to the prosecution's case, but her safety is obviously a concern. There may be other members of this conspiracy who aren't yet in custody." "How long will the trial process take?" Sarah asked, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Her pregnancy was advancing rapidly, and the stress of recent events had made her increasingly aware that her child would be born into whatever circumstances emerged from this legal battle. "Months, possibly longer," the judge admitted. Federal cases involving multiple territories and jurisdictions are complex. But Mrs. Rourke, you should know that the government is prepared to offer you and your family witness protection and relocation if necessary. Relocation? Thatcher's voice carried sharp concern. You're suggesting we leave Devil's Creek? I'm suggesting it might be safer than remaining in a place where your whereabouts are known to any remaining members of the conspiracy, Judge Morrison replied. The evidence Mrs. Rourke possesses could implicate people we haven't identified yet. Sarah felt a chill of fear that had nothing to do with the winter air. After fighting so hard to establish a home and community in Devil's Creek, the thought of having to flee again was almost unbearable. But the memory of Morrison's violence and Marcus's calculated cruelty reminded her that the danger was far from over. From the jail cell came the sound of Marcus's voice, raised in angry demands for legal representation and official communications with territorial authorities. The forged documents that had given him so much power were now evidence of his crimes, but Sarah knew he would not accept defeat without using every resource at his disposal. I want to speak with him, Sarah said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. Sarah, Thatcher said immediately, that's not wise. There's nothing to be gained from... There's everything to be gained, Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a strength that had grown through months of struggle and fear. I've been running from this man and what he represents since Thomas died. I want him to understand that he failed, that all his threats and manipulation accomplished nothing except exposing his own crimes. Sheriff Bradley looked uncertain. Mrs. Rourke, prisoners have been known to make threats, to say things designed to intimidate witnesses. Let him make threats, Sarah said firmly. I want him to see what he created by trying to destroy me. I want him to understand that his actions turned a grieving widow into the instrument of his own destruction. Judge Morrison studied Sarah's face carefully. Are you certain you're prepared for whatever he might say? Men like Marcus Lenning don't accept defeat gracefully, and he may try to hurt you in whatever way he can. He's already done the worst he could do, Sarah replied. He killed my husband, stole our property, tried to have me declared incompetent, and attempted to force me into a situation where I would have been completely under his control. What could he possibly say that would be worse than what he's already done? After several minutes of discussion, it was agreed that Sarah could speak with Marcus under carefully controlled conditions. Sheriff Bradley would be present, along with Thatcher and one of the federal marshals. The conversation would be brief and would end immediately if Marcus became threatening or abusive. As they approached the jail cell, Sarah could see Marcus sitting on the narrow cot, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and his pale eyes fixed on something beyond the bars. When he saw her approaching, his expression shifted from defeated resignation to calculating interest. Well, Marcus said, his voice carrying the same smooth tones that had once fooled her into thinking he was genuinely concerned for her welfare. The blushing bride comes to gloat over her enemy's misfortune. How very Christian of you, Sarah. I didn't come to gloat, Sarah replied calmly. I came to understand. You had money, position, a successful business. Why wasn't that enough? Why did you need to steal from people who had so little? Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Steal, my dear girl, I was providing a service. Those miners were going to lose their claims anyway. Most of them were too ignorant to manage their affairs properly. I simply expedited the process and ensured that the resources went to people who could use them productively. By murdering them. By removing obstacles to progress, Marcus corrected, his tone suggesting he genuinely saw no moral distinction. Thomas, for instance, was causing problems for everyone with his endless questions and accusations. His death was unfortunate, but necessary. The casual admission of murder, spoken as if discussing a business transaction, made Sarah's stomach turn. But it also strengthened her resolve. This was the man who had killed her husband, who had tried to steal her future, who had viewed her and her unborn child as nothing more than obstacles to be removed or controlled. "You made one crucial mistake," Sarah said quietly. "You assumed that because I was a woman and a widow, I would be helpless. You didn't consider that I might be strong enough to fight back, or that I might find people willing to help me." Marcus's expression darkened. "Your little community victory is temporary. Sarah, the men I worked with have resources you can't imagine. Even if I'm convicted, even if I hang, there will be consequences for what you've done." "Is that a threat?" Sheriff Bradley interjected, his hand moving to his weapon. "It's a statement of fact," Marcus replied calmly. "Sarah has made enemies she doesn't even know about, people who will view her testimony as a personal attack on their interests. Moving to this godforsaken frontier may have given her temporary safety, but it won't protect her forever." Thatcher stepped forward, his voice carrying quiet menace. "Let me make something clear, Lenning. My wife is under the protection of this community and the federal government. Any attempt to harm her will be met with consequences that your criminal friends won't survive." "Your wife," Marcus repeated mockingly. "A convenient marriage to legitimize an improper relationship. How long do you think that arrangement will last when the novelty wears off and you realize you've tied yourself to a woman with dangerous enemies?" Sarah felt Thatcher tense beside her, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Our marriage isn't based on convenience or necessity," she said firmly. "It's based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. Something you would never understand because you see people as objects to be used rather than human beings deserving of dignity." "Dignity," Marcus spat. "You want to talk about dignity? You're carrying another man's child, living on charity, reduced to accepting help from people who barely know you. Where's the dignity in that?" "The dignity is in choosing to fight, rather." "Then surrender," Sarah replied. "In finding the courage to speak truth, even when it's dangerous, in building relationships based on trust rather than fear." "You taught me something valuable, Marcus, that there are people in this world who will try to destroy you for their own benefit. But there are also people who will stand with you simply because it's right." For the first time since she had known him, Marcus appeared to have no ready response. The smooth confidence that had always characterized his interactions was finally cracking under the weight of his circumstances. "This conversation is over," Judge Morrison announced, clearly sensing that the exchange had served its purpose. "Mr. Lenning, you'll be transported to Denver for federal arraignment tomorrow morning." As they walked away from the jail, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion. The man who had haunted her dreams and driven her across half the country in fear was revealed to be not a powerful adversary, but a petty criminal whose schemes had finally collapsed under their own weight. "Are you all right?" Thatcher asked as they emerged into the morning sunlight. Sarah considered the question seriously. Was she all right? Yesterday she had been a bride celebrating her wedding with a community that had embraced her. Today she was a federal witness whose testimony could help dismantle a criminal conspiracy, but who might have to abandon the home she had fought so hard to establish. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "But I'm not afraid anymore. Marcus tried to make me believe I was powerless, that I had no choice but to accept whatever he decided was best for me. Now I know that was a lie. I do have choices, and I have people who will support whatever choice I make." The forged documents that had been Marcus's primary weapon against her were now evidence of his own crimes. The legal system he had manipulated to gain control over her circumstances was now turned against him, and the community that had rallied to her defense had proven that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win. As they walked back toward their home, the house that had become a symbol of safety and new beginnings, Sarah realized that Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as a victim, but as a woman who had discovered her own strength and the power of community solidarity. The confrontation with Marcus had provided the closure she needed, but more than that, it had confirmed what she had learned over these past weeks, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear, and that justice was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest, as Sarah prepared for her journey to Denver to testify before the federal grand jury, she received an unexpected gift that would carry profound meaning for the trials ahead. Mrs. Catherine Woods approached her one morning with a small, worn locket that had belonged to her own mother, a woman who had faced her own struggles in the early days of territorial settlement. "This has been in my family for 3 generations, Mrs. Woods explained as she fastened the delicate chain around Sarah's neck. "My grandmother wore it when she testified against claim jumpers who had murdered her husband. My mother wore it when she faced down a corrupt territorial judge who tried to steal our land. Now I want you to wear it when you stand up to the people who killed Thomas." The locket was simple silver, tarnished with age, but beautiful in its understated elegance. Inside was a tiny photograph of a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, Mrs. Woods's grandmother, who had apparently been the first in a line of strong women who refused to be intimidated by men who thought power gave them the right to victimize others. "I can't accept something so precious," Sarah protested, but Mrs. Woods waved away her objections. "You can and you will. That locket has given strength to women in my family for 60 years. Now it's going to give strength to you when you need it most." The significance of the gesture was not lost on Sarah. The locket represented more than family history. It symbolized the continuity of women's resistance to injustice, the passing down of courage from one generation to the next. As she touched the smooth silver surface, Sarah felt connected not just to Mrs. Woods's family, but to all the women who had fought for justice in impossible circumstances. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation for her testimony. Federal prosecutors had arrived from Denver to interview her extensively about Thomas's discoveries and Marcus's criminal network. Each session revealed new depths to the conspiracy, connections to mining companies, territorial officials, and even federal appointees who had used their positions to facilitate systematic theft and murder. Sarah's pregnancy had progressed to the point where travel would soon become dangerous, which added urgency to the legal proceedings. Dr. Harrison had insisted that she would need to return from Denver well before her due date, regardless of the trial schedule. The baby she carried would be born into whatever world emerged from this legal battle. "The prosecutors are confident about the case," Thatcher reported after meeting with the federal attorneys. "Your testimony, combined with Thomas's documentation and the evidence they've gathered from other territories, should be enough to secure convictions for the entire conspiracy." "And after?" Sarah asked, one hand resting on her rounded belly. "What happens to us once the trials are over?" It was a question that had haunted both of them during the weeks of preparation. The federal marshals had made it clear that relocating to a new territory under assumed names was still the safest option, despite the successful arrests. Criminal conspiracies of this magnitude often had connections that remained hidden until after the principals were convicted. "We could start over somewhere else," Thatcher said carefully. "Colorado Territory, maybe, or even California. Build a new life where no one knows our history." But Sarah could hear the reluctance in his voice. Devil's Creek had become home for both of them, not just a place they lived, but a community they belonged to. The thought of abandoning the people who had stood with them against Marcus's threats felt like another kind of defeat. "Or we could stay and fight for the life we've built here," Sarah said. "Show anyone who might threaten us that this community won't be intimidated." Eleanor Hartwell, who had been listening quietly from the kitchen where she was helping prepare for Sarah's departure, spoke up with characteristic directness. If you ask me, running away would be exactly the wrong message to send. You've proven that ordinary people can stand up to corruption and win. Leaving now would suggest that the victory was temporary. But staying could put everyone at risk, Sarah pointed out. If there are still members of the conspiracy who haven't been arrested, then we'll deal with them the same way we dealt with Marcus. Alice Murphy interrupted, entering the conversation with her usual bluntness. This community didn't protect you just because we liked you personally. We protected you because what was happening to you was wrong, and we don't tolerate that kind of injustice here. Dr. Harrison, who had been monitoring Sarah's condition daily as her departure approached, added his own perspective. From a medical standpoint, the stress of constant relocation and hiding would be harmful to both you and the baby. Stability and community support are crucial for a healthy pregnancy and successful childbirth. As they discussed the possibilities, Sarah found herself thinking about the locket Mrs. Woods had given her. The women in that family had faced their challenges head-on, refusing to be driven from their homes by men who thought intimidation was more powerful than justice. Perhaps it was time for her to follow their example. "I want to stay," she said finally, her voice carrying a conviction that surprised even her. "I want to raise my child in a place where people stand up for each other, where justice is possible, even when it's difficult. If we run away now, we're telling anyone who might threaten us in the future that we can be scared off." Thatcher studied her face carefully. "Are you certain? Once you testify in Denver, there's no taking it back. Everyone will know what role you played in exposing the conspiracy." "Good," Sarah replied firmly. "I want them to know. I want anyone who might consider targeting vulnerable people to understand that there are consequences, that communities like this one won't stand by and let injustice happen." The decision, once made, brought with it a sense of peace that Sarah hadn't expected. For months she had been running, from grief, from threats, from the overwhelming sense that she was powerless against forces beyond her control. But somewhere, during these weeks in Devil's Creek, she had stopped running and started fighting. Now she was ready to make her final stand. Judge Morrison, who had remained in town to coordinate with federal authorities, supported their decision to stay. "The government has a responsibility to protect witnesses who risk their safety for the cause of justice," she said. "If Mrs. Rourke is willing to testify, despite the personal danger, then we're obligated to ensure her safety here in Devil's Creek." "What kind of protection are we talking about?" Sheriff Bradley asked. "Federal marshals will maintain a presence in the territory until we're confident that all members of the conspiracy have been identified and arrested," Judge Morrison replied. "But more than that, Mrs. Rourke's courage in coming forward has inspired similar testimony from other territories. The case against the conspiracy is becoming so strong that any surviving members will be more concerned with avoiding prosecution than with silencing witnesses." As Sarah prepared for her journey to Denver, a trip that would separate her from Thatcher and the community that had become her strength, she felt none of the fear that had characterized her earlier travels. This time, she was traveling not as a refugee fleeing danger, but as a woman with a mission, carrying evidence that would bring justice for Thomas and all the other victims of Marcus's crimes. The night before her departure, the women of Devil's Creek gathered at her house for what Eleanor Hartwell called a blessing ceremony. It was an informal affair, but the significance was unmistakable. One by one, the women who had supported her spoke about what her courage had meant to them and to the community. "You showed us that we don't have to accept injustice just because it's wrapped in legal papers," Rebecca Torres said. "That ordinary people have the power to fight back against corruption. You proved that a woman alone isn't helpless if she has the support of other women," Alice Murphy added. "That communities can be stronger than individual wealth or political connections." When Mrs. Woods presented her with a small bundle of letters, messages of support from women in other territories who had heard about her case, Sarah realized that her personal struggle had become something larger. She had become a symbol of resistance to the kind of systematic victimization that had plagued the frontier territories for too long. "I don't know if I deserve all this attention," Sarah said as the evening wound down. "I was just trying to survive, to protect my child. And that's exactly why you deserve it," Eleanor replied. "You didn't set out to be a hero, Sarah. You just refused to give up when powerful people tried to destroy you. That's the kind of courage that changes the world." As the women departed and Sarah prepared for what might be her last night in the house that had become her sanctuary, she touched the locket Mrs. Woods had given her and thought about the generations of strong women whose legacy she was carrying. Forward, tomorrow she would travel to Denver to face federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and possibly members of the criminal conspiracy who had not yet been arrested. She would tell her story under oath, knowing that her words could help convict murderers and thieves, but also knowing that doing so would make her a permanent target for anyone seeking revenge. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of community, support, and wearing a locket that connected her to a tradition of women who had refused to be victimized, Sarah Rourke felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She was no longer running from her past, but walking confidently toward a future built on justice and mutual support. The final stand she was preparing to make was not just for herself or even for Thomas, but for every person who had ever been. Told they were powerless against corruption and intimidation, and that, she realized, was a cause worth any risk. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn morning that painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah stood before the new schoolhouse in Devil's Creek, holding a family photograph that would become part of the community's permanent record. The photograph captured a moment of perfect contentment, herself and Thatcher flanking 1-year-old Thomas, whose bright smile and sturdy build spoke to a childhood filled with love and security. The photograph itself was more than just a family portrait. It was visual proof of transformation, showing 3 people who had found each other through crisis and built something lasting from the most difficult circumstances. But more than that, it would serve as inspiration for future generations, who might face their own seemingly impossible challenges. "Mrs. Rourke," said the traveling photographer, who had come specifically to document Devil's Creek's remarkable story, "this image represents something unprecedented in my experience. I've photographed families across the territories, but I've never encountered a story quite like yours. A community that not only protected one of its most vulnerable members, but transformed her struggle into a catalyst for territorial reform. The past year had indeed brought changes that extended far beyond their personal happiness. The conviction of Marcus and his conspirators had triggered investigations in 6 other territories, resulting in the exposure of corruption networks that had operated with impunity for decades. Sarah's story had become a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept injustice. "The photograph will be displayed in the schoolhouse," Eleanor Hartwell explained as she supervised. "The arrangement of various historical artifacts that would help future students understand their community's role in territorial history. Alongside the petition, the women signed supporting you, copies of Thomas's mining records, and documentation of how the federal investigation unfolded." Sarah watched as Eleanor carefully placed the petition under glass, preserving the signatures of women who had risked social disapproval and potential retaliation to stand up for someone they barely knew. The names on that document represented more than community support. They represented a moment when frontier women had claimed their voices in matters of justice and law. "Mama!" Thomas called out from where he was playing with wooden blocks near the schoolhouse steps, his vocabulary expanding daily as he absorbed the conversations and activities that surrounded him. At 1 year old, he was a confident, curious child who approached the world with the kind of fearlessness that came from never having experienced genuine danger. Thatcher scooped up his son, spinning him around until Thomas giggled with delight. The sight of them together, the quiet, grieving man transformed into a playful father, the child who would grow up never doubting his place in the world, captured everything Sarah had hoped for during those dark months of uncertainty. "He'll grow up hearing this story," Thatcher said as he settled Thomas on his shoulders. "Not just as family history, but as community history. He'll understand that his mother was brave enough to fight for justice, and that his community was strong enough to support her." Dr. Harrison, who had become both family friend and community historian, approached with a leather-bound journal that he had been keeping throughout the events. "I've been documenting everything," he explained. "Not just the legal proceedings, but the community response, the way neighbors came together, the transformation of individual crisis into collective action. Future historians will want to understand how this happened." The journal represented another form of legacy, a detailed record of how ordinary people had recognized injustice and chosen to act despite personal risk. It would serve as both inspiration and instruction for communities that might face similar challenges in years to come. "What does the future hold for your family?" the photographer asked as he prepared his equipment for additional shots of the schoolhouse and community buildings. Sarah and Thatcher exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that had developed between them over months of shared challenges and daily partnership. "We're expecting another child," Sarah said, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat belly. "Due in the spring." The announcement brought congratulations from the assembled neighbors, but Sarah was thinking about what it meant for their expanding family. This second child would be born into completely different circumstances than Thomas, not as a symbol of survival, but as a celebration of security, not as a refuge from danger, but as evidence of a love that had grown from practical beginnings into something deep and lasting. "And we're planning to expand the ranch," Thatcher added. "With the restitution money from Marcus's conviction, we can purchase additional land, hire more help, maybe start a horse breeding operation. Thomas will have something substantial to inherit." But beyond the practical plans lay deeper aspirations. Sarah had indeed accepted several speaking engagements, traveling to women's organizations across the territories to share her story and encourage others to recognize their own power to resist injustice. Her experiences in Devil's Creek had taught her that individual courage, supported by community solidarity, could achieve what seemed impossible. "The most important legacy," Sarah said as she watched Thomas exploring the schoolhouse yard with the confident curiosity of a child who knew he was safe and loved, "is the understanding that communities have the power to protect their most vulnerable members, that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary justice when they work together." Mrs. Catherine Woods, now in her 70s, but still sharp and determined, approached with the locket she had given Sarah during the crisis. "I want this back," she said with a smile that took the sting out of her words. Sarah felt a moment of concern. Had she somehow failed to live up to the legacy the locket represented? "Not because you don't deserve it," Mrs. Woods continued, "but because I want to give it to someone else who needs its strength. Your daughter, when she's old enough to understand what it means. This locket should stay in families that understand the importance of fighting for what's right." The certainty in Mrs. Woods's voice, her assumption that the expected child would be a daughter, her confidence that Sarah's family would continue the tradition of standing up to injustice, felt like both blessing and responsibility. But it was a responsibility Sarah was ready to embrace. As the photography session concluded and the community began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing alone in the schoolhouse, surrounded by the artifacts of their shared history. The petition, the mining records, the documentation of the federal investigation, all of it represented a moment when justice had prevailed over corruption, when community had triumphed over individual greed. But more than that, it represented the power of ordinary people to create change when they refused to accept that things had to remain as they were. Sarah had begun her journey to Devil's Creek as a desperate widow with no resources, except her own determination. She was ending this chapter of her story as a woman who had helped transform not just her own circumstances, but the entire territorial approach to corruption and justice. Thatcher appeared in the doorway, Thomas in his arms, backlit by the golden autumn sunlight that made them both look like figures from a painting about frontier happiness. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Home. The word carried weight and meaning that it hadn't possessed when Sarah first arrived in Devil's Creek. Then, home had been something she had lost, something she was searching for, something that existed only in memory. Now, home was something she had built, something that grew stronger every day, something that would provide foundation for future generations. "Ready," she said, taking one last look around the schoolhouse that would preserve their story for children not yet born. As they walked back toward their ranch, past the church where they had been married, past the houses of neighbors who had become family, past the meadows where wildflowers would bloom again come spring, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperation to contentment, from victim to advocate, from survivor to someone who helped others survive. The family photograph that would hang in the schoolhouse captured a moment in time, but it also represented something timeless, the possibility that love could grow from the most practical beginnings, that justice was achievable even under the most difficult circumstances, that communities had the power to protect and nurture their most vulnerable members. Thomas babbled contentedly from his father's arms, pointing at everything that caught his interest: horses, birds, flowers, clouds. His world was filled with wonders to explore and people who loved him, and he approached each day with the kind of confidence that came from never having experienced fear or want. As they reached their house, the place where Sarah had first found sanctuary and where she had built the life she had fought so hard to protect, she thought about the child she was carrying and the legacy they would inherit. Not just property or money, but something more valuable, the knowledge that they came from people who had faced impossible odds and found ways to prevail. The setting sun painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and purple, creating the kind of beauty that made frontier life feel like a daily gift. Inside their home, the dinner table was set for three, with a high chair that proclaimed Thomas's secure place in their family. The evening routine of feeding, bathing, and storytelling lay ahead, the ordinary domestic pleasures that had become extraordinary because they had been won through struggle and sacrifice. As Sarah settled into the rocking chair by the fire to nurse Thomas one last time before bedtime, she touched the spot where Mrs. Woods's locket had hung and thought about the daughter who might someday wear it. That future child would grow up hearing the story of how her mother had found the courage to fight back against corruption, how her community had stood together in the face of intimidation, how justice had ultimately prevailed over the forces that tried to silence truth. The family photograph hanging in the schoolhouse would remind future generations that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they refused to accept injustice. But here, in the warmth of their home, surrounded by the love they had built from the most difficult circumstances, Sarah knew that their real legacy was simpler and more profound. The proof that hope could take root and flourish even in the harshest conditions, creating something beautiful that would endure long after the struggles that created it were forgotten. Outside, the Wyoming wind whispered through the trees that Thatcher had planted, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come. Inside, a family that had been forged in crisis settled into the quiet contentment of people who had fought for their happiness and won the right to enjoy it without fear. The story that had begun with a desperate knock on a stranger's door had become a legacy of courage, community, and the enduring power of love to transform even the most difficult circumstances into something beautiful and lasting.